In the constellation of 20th century intellectual achievement, few figures shine with the distinctive brilliance of Simone de Beauvoir. Born in Paris on January 9, 1908, into a world still clinging to the certainties of the Belle Époque, this extraordinary woman would become one of the most influential philosophers of the modern age, transforming how humanity understands freedom, ethics, gender, and the very meaning of human existence. Simone de Beauvoir stands as perhaps the most complete existentialist thinker, a philosopher who not only articulated profound theoretical insights, but lived them with unflinching courage and radical authenticity. What makes de Beauvoir extraordinary is not merely her formidable intellect, though her philosophical acumen was legendary and led her to become the youngest person ever to pass the aggregation examination in philosophy at the Sorbonne. Nor is it simply her prolific output, although she authored groundbreaking philosophical treatises, innovative novels, penetrating memoirs, and incisive political essays that collectively span more than 50 years of sustained intellectual production. What truly sets her apart is the revolutionary completeness of her vision, a philosophy that refused to separate abstract thought from lived experience, ethical theory from political action, or personal freedom from collective liberation. Her philosophy emerges from a profound engagement with what she identified as the fundamental problem of human existence. We are beings condemned to be free, thrown into a world we did not create, forced to make choices without any pre-given essence or predetermined nature to guide us, yet held absolutely responsible for what we make of ourselves and our world. This existential condition, which might have led to despair or paralysis, became for de Beauvoir the foundation for a philosophy of radical responsibility, authentic engagement, and transformative action that continues to inspire and challenge readers nearly a century after she began writing. De Beauvoir's genius lies in her ability to integrate seemingly contradictory insights into a coherent philosophical vision. She was simultaneously a rigorous existentialist who emphasized individual freedom, and a committed socialist who recognized the material and social constraints that limit human possibility. She was a profound analyst of abstract philosophical problems and a keen observer of concrete human situations in all their messy particularity. She was a defender of absolute moral responsibility and a sophisticated critic of simplistic moral judgments that fail to account for the ambiguity inherent in human existence. She showed how philosophy could be both intellectually rigorous and politically engaged, how literature could serve philosophical purposes without becoming mere illustration of abstract ideas, and how personal life could become a laboratory for testing and refining philosophical insights. The journey we are about to undertake through de Beauvoir's complete philosophical system will reveal a mind of extraordinary range and depth. We will explore her revolutionary analysis of human freedom and the paradoxes it creates, her systematic critique of oppression in all its forms, her masterful integration of existentialist philosophy with feminist analysis, her profound insights into the ethics of ambiguity, and her sophisticated understanding of how individuals and societies can move from conditions of oppression toward authentic liberation. We will discover how she developed a theory of the other that transformed philosophical anthropology, how her understanding of embodiment and situation challenged traditional philosophical assumptions, and how her concept of constructive action provides guidance for navigating the moral complexities of political engagement. Most importantly, we will see how de Beauvoir's philosophy provides a comprehensive framework for understanding what it means to be human in the modern world, a world characterized by unprecedented freedom and equally unprecedented responsibility, by the dissolution of traditional certainties and the urgent need to create new meanings, by the recognition of radical contingency and the demand for committed action. Her teachings remain as relevant today as they were when she first articulated them, because they address perennial human concerns about freedom and constraint, authenticity and bad faith, individual responsibility and collective action, all while remaining firmly grounded in the concrete realities of historical existence. De Beauvoir refused the comfort of philosophical systems that claim to have discovered final truths or ultimate solutions. Instead, she embraced what she called the ethics of ambiguity, recognizing that human existence is fundamentally characterized by tensions that cannot be finally resolved but must be continually negotiated through choices that are always made in uncertainty, always provisional, always subject to revision in light of new experience and understanding. This philosophical modesty, combined with unwavering commitment to human liberation, makes her thought particularly valuable for those seeking guidance in navigating the moral and existential challenges of contemporary life. Part 1. The Formation of Consciousness. The story of how Simone de Beauvoir became a philosopher reads like a case study in the collision between traditional expectations and individual aspiration, between the security of inherited certainties and the vertiginous freedom of self-creation. Born into a bourgeois Catholic family that valued respectability and convention above all else, young Simone experienced firsthand the contradictions that would later become central to her philosophical analysis: the gap between professed values and actual practices, the ways social institutions shape individual consciousness, and the profound difficulty of achieving authentic existence within structures designed to enforce conformity. Her childhood in early 20th century Paris provided rich material for philosophical reflection on the constructed nature of identity and the social mechanisms that maintain systems of domination. Her father, Georges de Beauvoir, was a lawyer whose career never achieved the success his aristocratic pretensions demanded, leaving the family in a condition of what de Beauvoir would later describe as genteel poverty, maintaining the appearances of bourgeois respectability while lacking the economic foundation that supposedly justified bourgeois privilege. Her mother, Françoise, was a devout Catholic whose piety represented the traditional religious faith that still governed the lives of respectable French families despite the official secularism of the Third Republic. The young Simone absorbed these contradictions with the acute sensitivity of an intelligent child, growing up in a household characterized by unspoken tensions and unfulfilled aspirations. She witnessed how her father's intellectual pretensions coexisted with casual misogyny and unexamined class prejudice. She observed how her mother's religious devotion served simultaneously as genuine spiritual commitment and as psychological compensation for a life of domestic confinement and emotional frustration. She experienced directly the double standards that governed the lives of bourgeois girls and boys, the former prepared for lives of decorative domesticity, the latter for active engagement with the world beyond the family. The religious faith of her childhood provided de Beauvoir's first comprehensive framework for understanding reality and her place within it. Catholic doctrine offered clear answers to ultimate questions about the meaning of existence, the nature of good and evil, and the proper conduct of life. The rituals and practices of Catholic worship created a sense of participation in something larger than individual existence, a transcendent order that gave dignity and purpose even to the most mundane activities. The community of believers provided social belonging and collective identity that seemed to anchor individual existence in something permanent and significant. But this religious framework began to crack under the pressure of de Beauvoir's developing critical intelligence and her growing awareness of the contradictions between religious teaching and lived reality. She noticed how religious principles that supposedly applied universally were actually interpreted in ways that conveniently supported existing social hierarchies and power relationships. She observed how the promise of eternal reward in heaven functioned to make bearable conditions of injustice and oppression in the present world. She questioned how a supposedly all-good and all-powerful God could permit the suffering and evil she witnessed around her. The crisis of faith that de Beauvoir experienced in early adolescence was not a sudden dramatic conversion, but a gradual erosion of belief as accumulating questions overwhelmed the capacity of religious doctrine to provide satisfactory answers. By the age of 14, she had quietly abandoned the Catholic faith that had structured her childhood consciousness, though she continued to participate in religious observances to avoid conflict with her family. This loss of faith, which might have been experienced as purely negative, actually opened space for the philosophical project that would occupy the rest of her life. The search for meaning and value in a world without God, without pre-given essences, without transcendent guarantees. The recognition that she would have to create her own meaning rather than discovering it in some pre-existing order was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberation came from the realization that she was not bound by the narrow scripts that bourgeois Catholic society had prepared for girls of her class and background. She could refuse the destiny of marriage, motherhood, and domestic confinement that was presented as natural and inevitable. She could pursue intellectual development and professional achievement in domains traditionally reserved for men. She could choose her own values and create her own life according to principles she selected through her own reflection and judgment. But this freedom was also terrifying because it came with absolute responsibility. Without divine commandments to follow or natural essences to fulfill, every choice became a leap into uncertainty, every action a commitment to values that could not be finally justified by appeal to any authority beyond human decision. The comfortable security of inherited certainties gave way to the anxious awareness that human beings must create meaning in a universe that provides no inherent meaning, must establish values in a world that contains no objective values, must construct identities without any fixed nature to guide the construction. De Beauvoir's education at elite Parisian institutions provided her with the intellectual tools necessary for developing a systematic philosophy adequate to this existential situation. At the Sorbonne, and later at the École Normale Supérieure, she encountered the full range of philosophical traditions that had attempted to address questions about knowledge, reality, value, and human existence. She studied the rationalist tradition from Descartes through Kant, learning how reason could be used to establish certain knowledge and universal moral principles. She engaged with empiricist approaches that grounded knowledge in sensory experience and scientific method. She absorbed the phenomenological innovations of Husserl and Heidegger, which showed how to describe the structures of consciousness and existence without reducing them to either objective facts or subjective impressions. But the philosophical approach that resonated most deeply with de Beauvoir's own experience and temperament was existentialism, particularly as developed by her lifelong companion Jean-Paul Sartre. Existentialism began not with abstract questions about the nature of reality or the foundations of knowledge, but with the concrete lived experience of existing as a human being in the world. It recognized that human existence precedes any essence that might be attributed to human nature, meaning that we create what we are through our actions, rather than expressing some pre-given nature through our behavior. The famous existentialist maxim that existence precedes essence captured perfectly the insight that de Beauvoir had reached through her own experience. Human beings are not born with predetermined natures that unfold according to some inner logic, but rather come into the world as pure possibility that must be realized through action in concrete situations. A human being is nothing other than what they make of themselves through their choices, which means that human freedom is absolute and human responsibility is total. There is no human nature to appeal to as justification for particular choices, no divine plan to follow, no objective values to discover, only the perpetual necessity of choosing and the perpetual responsibility for the consequences of those choices. De Beauvoir's first major philosophical work, She Came to Stay, though written in the form of a novel, already contains the essential elements of her mature philosophical vision. The narrative explores the complex relationship between three characters whose lives become entangled in ways that reveal the fundamental structures of human existence and interpersonal relationships. Through the dramatic conflicts and psychological tensions that develop, de Beauvoir investigates questions about consciousness and otherness, freedom and constraint, authenticity and bad faith that would occupy her philosophical attention throughout her career. The novel demonstrates de Beauvoir's conviction that philosophical insights could be explored and communicated through literary form as effectively as through traditional philosophical treatises. Fiction allowed her to present philosophical problems in their full concrete complexity rather than in the abstracted form required by systematic philosophical argument. Characters in novels exist. In specific situations, possess particular histories, face concrete choices with real consequences, experience the ambiguity and uncertainty that characterize actual human existence. Through narrative, readers could experience vicariously the existential dilemmas that philosophy attempted to analyze conceptually, making philosophical insights accessible and compelling in ways that abstract argumentation alone could not achieve. But de Beauvoir's use of literary form was not simply a pedagogical strategy for making philosophy more accessible to general audiences. Rather, it reflected her understanding that human existence itself has a narrative structure that cannot be adequately captured through purely conceptual analysis. Human beings experience their lives as stories unfolding through time, with each present moment incorporating a past that cannot be changed and projecting toward a future that remains open to multiple possibilities. The meaning of particular actions and experiences becomes clear only retrospectively, in light of the larger narrative patterns into which they fit. Identity itself is not a fixed substance but an ongoing narrative construction, perpetually being written and rewritten as new experiences are integrated into the story of who one is. This integration of philosophical analysis with literary expression, which would characterize all of de Beauvoir's major works, exemplifies her larger commitment to overcoming the false dichotomies that had plagued Western philosophy: mind and body, theory and practice, thought and action, individual and society, freedom and situation. Her philosophy would show how these apparently opposed terms are actually interdependent aspects of the complex unity that constitutes human existence. Understanding this unity requires multiple approaches and multiple forms of expression, philosophical treatises and literary works, abstract analysis and concrete description, theoretical investigation and practical engagement. Part 2, The Ethics of Ambiguity. In 1947, Simone de Beauvoir published what would become one of the defining texts of existentialist philosophy, The Ethics of Ambiguity. This remarkable work addressed what many critics had identified as the central problem facing existentialism. If there are no objective values or predetermined human essences, if everything depends on human freedom and choice, then how can we distinguish between better and worse choices? How can we make moral judgments? How can we avoid sliding into nihilism or radical relativism in which every choice is as good as any other? De Beauvoir's response to these challenges provides not only a defense of existentialist ethics, but a positive articulation of ethical principles grounded in the very structures of human existence itself. The title of the work captures its central insight. Human existence is fundamentally characterized by ambiguity, by tensions and paradoxes that cannot be finally resolved, but must be continually negotiated through choices made in conditions of uncertainty. We are simultaneously free and situated, subjects and objects, individuals and social beings, finite creatures aware of our own mortality, yet capable of transcending our immediate circumstances through imagination and action. These are not problems to be solved through better analysis or more comprehensive knowledge, but permanent features of the human condition that must be acknowledged and embraced rather than denied or evaded. De Beauvoir begins her ethical analysis by examining what she calls the paradox of existence. Human beings are the only beings for whom their own being is at issue. Unlike rocks or trees or even animals that simply are what they are, human beings must continually choose what to make of themselves. We exist as projects, perpetually projecting ourselves toward futures that do not yet exist, giving meaning to our present situations through the possibilities toward which we orient ourselves. But this freedom, which might seem purely liberating, actually creates the fundamental ethical problem, precisely because we are free, because nothing determines in advance what we should do or who we should be. We bear absolute responsibility for our choices. This responsibility cannot be evaded by appealing to external authorities or predetermined natures. When we claim to be following divine commands or natural laws or social conventions, we are actually making a choice to recognize these as authoritative, a choice for which we remain fully responsible. The religious believer who obeys God's commandments has chosen to recognize these particular texts or traditions as divine revelation rather than human invention. The naturalist who grounds morality in human nature has chosen to privilege certain features of human life as essential while treating others as accidental. The conformist who follows social conventions has chosen to value social approval over other possible goods. De Beauvoir shows how recognition of this absolute freedom and responsibility can provoke various forms of flight from freedom, strategies for evading the anxiety that comes with recognizing that we are radically free. She identifies several typical patterns of bad faith, self-deceptive attempts to deny or escape from freedom by treating oneself as something other than what one is, a free consciousness capable of transcending any particular situation through imaginative projection toward alternative possibilities. The subman, as de Beauvoir terms one pattern of flight from freedom, refuses to acknowledge their own freedom and treats themselves as a mere object determined by external forces. This person sees themselves as a victim of circumstances, helplessly shaped by their upbringing, their social position, their psychological traits, their biological nature. Whatever happens to them seems inevitable, beyond their control, not their responsibility. This stance provides comfort by eliminating the anxiety of choice, but it does so at the cost of reducing oneself to a thing rather than a person, an object rather than a subject. The serious man represents another form of flight from freedom, one particularly common among those who hold positions of power and privilege in existing social hierarchies. The serious man treats the values and institutions of their society as objective features of reality rather than human constructions that could be otherwise. They identify themselves completely with their social roles and functions, deriving their sense of identity and worth from their position in a supposedly natural order. The businessman who sees profit maximization as an objective good, the bureaucrat who identifies themselves with their official function, the traditionalist who treats established customs as sacred and eternal, all exemplify this seriousness that refuses to acknowledge the contingency of human values and institutions. The nihilist pursues yet another strategy for evading freedom, acknowledging the absence of objective values but concluding from this that nothing matters, that all choices are equally meaningless. Where the sub-man denies their freedom and the serious man denies the freedom of values, the nihilist acknowledges both, but draws the conclusion that freedom without objectively grounded values renders all action pointless. This leads either to withdrawal from engagement with the world, or to arbitrary violence that expresses contempt for the values that others naively continue to take seriously. De Beauvoir shows how each of these patterns of bad faith involves a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between freedom and value. They assume that authentic values must be either objectively given independently of human choice or purely arbitrary products of subjective preference. But this binary framework misses the actual character of human values, which are neither discovered in some pre-existing realm nor invented from nothing, but rather created through acts of freedom that genuinely bring new meaning into existence, while remaining constrained by the situations within which freedom operates. The authentic response to the human condition, according to de Beauvoir's analysis, involves what she calls assuming one's freedom, which means acknowledging that one is free, accepting responsibility for one's choices, and committing oneself to projects that affirm and expand both one's own freedom and the freedom of others. This is not a simple formula that can be mechanically applied, but a general orientation that must be worked out concretely in each particular situation through reflection and judgment. Assuming one's freedom begins with honest recognition of the basic structure of human existence. We are free consciousness thrown into situations we did not choose, facing futures that are open to multiple possibilities, forced to create meaning through our choices without any guarantee that the meanings we create will endure or that our projects will succeed. This recognition requires courage because it exposes us to the anxiety that comes with acknowledging that we are ultimately alone in our freedom, that no external authority can relieve us of the burden of choosing, that we will die having made only some of the infinite possible choices available to us. But this assumption of freedom is not merely a private psychological achievement. De Beauvoir insists that authentic freedom necessarily involves concern for the freedom of others, because human freedom is not an isolated individual possession, but a relational phenomenon that can only be realized in and through relationships with other free beings. My freedom is meaningless if it exists in a world where all others are enslaved or oppressed. The projects through which I give meaning to my existence depend on the recognition and response of others, who are themselves free to accept or reject the meanings I propose. Therefore, willing my own freedom logically entails willing a world in which others are also free to pursue their own projects and create their own meanings. This leads to what de Beauvoir identifies as the fundamental ethical imperative of existentialism. One should will oneself free and will others free. This is not an arbitrary prescription imposed from outside human existence, but a principle grounded in the very structure of freedom itself. To will oneself free while willing others enslaved involves a contradiction, because the freedom of isolated consciousness is literally meaningless, a pure abstraction that cannot be realized in concrete existence. Real freedom exists only in relationship with other freedoms, only in a world where human beings mutually recognize each other as free subjects capable of creating meaning through their projects. But de Beauvoir immediately recognizes the complexity this principle introduces into ethical deliberation. The command to will others free sounds simple until one confronts concrete situations in which different people's freedoms appear to conflict, in which expanding the freedom of some requires constraining the freedom of others, in which the immediate satisfaction of freedom for one group requires limiting the freedom of another group in the short term to create conditions for greater freedom in the future. These are not theoretical puzzles to be solved through better conceptual analysis, but permanent features of ethical life in a world characterized by scarcity, conflict, and the tragic reality that not all goods can be simultaneously realized. De Beauvoir's response to these ethical complications involves what she calls the principle of moral action. One should act in ways that increase the total sum of human freedom in the world, while recognizing that such calculations are always uncertain and that the outcomes of actions can never be fully predicted or controlled. This requires developing what she calls moral sensitivity, the ability to attend carefully to the concrete particularities of each situation, to recognize the multiple competing values and interests at stake, to imagine alternative courses of action and their likely consequences, and to make choices that reflect genuine engagement with the complexity rather than simple application of abstract rules. The ethics of ambiguity thus rejects both rigid moral absolutism that claims to possess eternal unchanging moral truths and lazy moral relativism that treats all choices as equally valid. Instead, it advocates for what might be called situated moral judgment, recognition that ethical principles must be applied thoughtfully to particular circumstances, that the same action might be right in one context and wrong in another, that moral growth involves developing the wisdom to navigate these complexities rather than learning to follow simple formulas. This approach to ethics has profound implications for how we should understand moral responsibility and moral judgment. We are responsible not only for the intended consequences of our actions, but also for foreseeable unintended consequences, for the meanings our actions take on in the social world beyond our individual intentions, for the ways our choices either expand or contract the freedom available to others. But moral responsibility does not require moral perfection or the absence of moral error. Because we always act in conditions of uncertainty, with incomplete information, from situated perspectives that necessarily involve blind spots, moral mistakes are inevitable. What matters is not achieving perfection, but maintaining commitment to human freedom, willingness to acknowledge errors when they become apparent, and capacity to adjust one's understanding and behavior in light of new experience. Part 3. The question of the other. One of Simone de Beauvoir's most profound and enduring contributions to philosophy concerns her analysis of how human consciousness relates to other consciousnesses, what she calls the problem of the other. This question, which had troubled philosophers from the ancient Greeks through the modern phenomenologists, takes on particular urgency within existentialist philosophy because of its emphasis on individual freedom and subjectivity. If each consciousness is fundamentally free and self-creating, if existence precedes essence and there is no predetermined human nature that unites all people, then how do we understand relationships between different consciousnesses? How does recognition of other free beings affect my own freedom? How can authentic relationships be established between beings who are each centers of their own worlds? De Beauvoir's treatment of this problem draws on but ultimately transforms the analysis developed by Hegel in his famous discussion of the master-slave dialectic and extended by Jean-Paul Sartre in his phenomenology of interpersonal relationships. Hegel had shown how self-consciousness arises through a struggle for recognition between different consciousnesses, each seeking to establish its own reality through the acknowledgement of the other. Sartre had analysed how the look of another person can transform me from subject to object, making me aware of myself as I appear to another consciousness, rather than as I experience myself from within my own perspective. But de Beauvoir recognised that these analyses, brilliant though they were, remained trapped within a framework that treated relationships between consciousnesses as fundamentally antagonistic, as struggles for dominance in which one consciousness could affirm itself only by negating or subjugating the other. She saw how this framework, while capturing important aspects of actual interpersonal relationships, especially relationships structured by systems of domination and oppression, missed the possibility of reciprocal recognition in which different consciousnesses mutually affirm each other's freedom without one subjugating the other. The key to understanding de Beauvoir's alternative lies in recognizing that she begins not with isolated individual consciousness that then encounters other consciousnesses as threats or limitations, but with the fundamental reality that human existence is always already social, always already embedded in relationships with others that precede any particular individual's emergence as a distinct self. We are born into webs of relationship that shape our consciousness from the beginning. We learn language, which means learning to think and speak in categories created by others. We develop identities through processes of recognition and response that involve other people from our earliest moments of awareness. This means that the other is not primarily a threat to my freedom, but rather a condition for the possibility of freedom itself. I become conscious of myself as a free subject only through relationships with others who recognize me as such. My projects derive their meaning from the responses they elicit in others, who are themselves pursuing their own projects. The very concepts and values through which I understand myself and my world are social products created through countless interactions between free beings over generations of human history. But de Beauvoir also recognized that this fundamental sociality of human existence does not automatically produce relationships of mutual recognition and reciprocal freedom. In actual human societies, relationships between different consciousnesses are typically structured by systems of domination that position some people as subjects whose freedom and agency are recognized and affirmed, while positioning others as objects whose existence serves primarily to support and validate the subjectivity of the dominant group. These hierarchical structures of recognition create what de Beauvoir would later analyze in detail as situations of oppression in which the freedom of some human beings is systematically constrained to enhance the freedom and security of others. The mechanism through which such oppressive relationships are established and maintained involves what de Beauvoir calls the transformation of the other into the other, the construction of certain groups of human beings as fundamentally different from and inferior to the dominant group. This transformation operates through a kind of bad faith on the part of the dominant group, a refusal to recognize the full humanity and freedom of those they dominate. The dominant group treats members of subordinated groups as objects rather than subjects, as beings defined by their supposed essence rather than by their existential freedom, as creatures governed by nature rather than by conscious choice. This analysis led de Beauvoir to recognize that the problem of the other is not merely a theoretical question for philosophical analysis, but a practical problem that manifests in actual social relationships structured by domination and oppression. Understanding these relationships requires attention not only to the phenomenological structures of consciousness and intersubjectivity, but also to the material and social conditions that shape how different consciousnesses encounter and relate to each other. Philosophy must engage with sociology, psychology, history, and political economy if it is to adequately grasp the full complexity of how human beings create and sustain both oppressive and liberatory relationships. But de Beauvoir's analysis goes deeper than merely identifying the social construction of oppressive relationships. She shows how the transformation of the other into the other involves a kind of complicity on the part of both the dominant and the dominated, though the nature and degree of this complicity differ fundamentally between the two positions. Those who benefit from systems of domination practice bad faith by refusing to acknowledge the freedom and full humanity of those they dominate. But those who are dominated can also fall into bad faith by accepting their assigned position as natural or inevitable, by identifying with the definitions imposed upon them by their oppressors, by failing to recognize and exercise their own freedom even within the constraints imposed by oppressive systems. This recognition led de Beauvoir to one of her most important and controversial ethical insights. Liberation from oppression requires not only external changes in social structures and institutions, but also internal transformation in the consciousness of both oppressors and oppressed. The oppressed must recognize and assert their own freedom, even before external conditions are fully favorable for exercising that freedom. They must refuse to accept the definitions imposed upon them by systems of domination, and must begin to create new meanings and new identities that reflect their own projects and values, rather than internalizing the judgments of their oppressors. But this does not mean, as some critics have mistakenly suggested, that de Beauvoir blames the victims of oppression for their own oppression, or suggests that liberation is merely a matter of changing one's attitude. She insists repeatedly that oppressive social structures create real material and psychological constraints that cannot be overcome through individual will alone. Someone living in conditions of extreme poverty, someone subjected to systematic violence, someone denied access to education or meaningful work, someone excluded from political participation cannot simply will themselves free through an internal change of consciousness. Rather, de Beauvoir's point is that liberation requires both external structural change and internal transformation of consciousness, and that these two dimensions of liberation must proceed together in a dialectical relationship. External changes in social conditions create new possibilities for freedom that previously did not exist, making it possible for people to exercise capacities and pursue projects that were previously foreclosed. But these new external possibilities can only be realized if people recognize and seize them, if they develop the skills and confidence necessary to exercise their freedom, if they create new forms of solidarity and collective action that can sustain and defend the gains achieved. This understanding of liberation as requiring both external and internal transformation reflects de Beauvoir's consistent refusal of reductionist approaches that try to explain human existence entirely in terms of either material conditions or consciousness, either external structures or internal experience. Human beings exist simultaneously as embodied creatures whose possibilities are shaped by material circumstances and as free consciousnesses capable of transcending their immediate situations through imagination and action. Any adequate account of human existence must attend to both dimensions and their complex interactions. The implications of this analysis extend far beyond the theoretical question of how consciousness relates to other consciousnesses. De Beauvoir shows how the structure of relationships between self and other manifests in everything from intimate personal relationships to large-scale social and political movements. In romantic relationships, the question is whether partners relate to each other as mutual subjects who recognize and support each other's freedom, or whether one partner is reduced to an object whose existence serves primarily to validate and support the subjectivity of the other. In parent-child relationships, the question is whether parents respect the emerging freedom of their children and help them develop the capacity for authentic self-creation, or whether they treat children as extensions of themselves whose lives should realize the unfulfilled projects of their parents. In political movements, the question is whether different groups seeking liberation recognize and support each other's freedom in relationships of genuine solidarity, or whether they reproduce the structures of domination they ostensibly oppose, with some groups pursuing their own liberation at the expense of others or imposing their own definitions of freedom on those they claim to help. De Beauvoir's analysis provides tools for recognizing and critiquing these patterns wherever they appear, while also offering positive vision of how relationships based on mutual recognition and reciprocal freedom might be constructed and sustained. Part 4, The Second Sex and the Analysis of Oppression. In 1949, Simone de Beauvoir published what would become not only her most famous work, but one of the most influential books of the 20th century. The Second Sex represents a monumental achievement in philosophical analysis, combining existentialist theory with historical research, anthropological observation, biological investigation, and literary criticism to produce a comprehensive account of women's oppression and the possibilities for women's liberation. The book's opening declaration, "One is not born but rather becomes a woman," would reverberate through feminist theory and political movements for generations, fundamentally transforming how human beings understand gender identity and the relationship between biology and social construction. The genesis of the second sex reveals much about de Beauvoir's philosophical method and her commitment to addressing concrete problems of human existence, rather than remaining in the realm of pure abstraction. The project began almost accidentally, when de Beauvoir decided to write about her own experience as a woman, and realized that before she could do so, she needed to understand what it meant to be a woman in the first place. This seemingly simple question opened onto an abyss of complexity that required years of research and analysis to adequately address. She discovered that the meaning of being a woman was not a biological given that could be read off from anatomical facts, but a social construction built up over millennia of human history through myths, institutions, practices, and ideologies that positioned women as the second sex, as the other, in relation to occupied the position of the essential, the absolute, the subject. De Beauvoir's analysis begins with a devastating critique of various attempts to explain women's subordination as natural, necessary, or inevitable. She examines and rejects biological determinism, the claim that women's social position follows necessarily from facts about female anatomy, reproductive capacity, or hormonal constitution, while acknowledging that biological differences between male and female bodies are real and have consequences for lived experience. She shows how these differences have been systematically interpreted in ways that justify and naturalize women's subordination. The fact that women bear children and men do not is a biological reality, but the conclusion that women should therefore be confined to domestic roles while men occupy the public sphere is a social interpretation that could be otherwise. She turns her analytical gaze toward psychoanalytic explanations, particularly those of Freud, which attempt to ground women's psychology and social position in supposedly universal features of psychosexual development. While appreciating psychoanalysis's recognition that sexuality and gender identity involve complex psychological processes rather than simple biological, determination, de Beauvoir shows how Freudian theory takes male experience as the norm and interprets female development as a kind of deviation or deficiency. The infamous concept of penis envy, which Freud presented as a universal feature of female psychology, reveals more about the male psychoanalyst's inability to imagine female experience on its own terms than about the actual psychology of women. Historical materialism, particularly as developed by Engels and other Marxist theorists, provides more promising resources for understanding women's oppression by connecting it to economic structures and property relations. De Beauvoir acknowledges the importance of economic factors in shaping gender relations, particularly the ways that women's exclusion from productive labour and their confinement to domestic reproduction serves the interests of capitalist accumulation. But she argues that economic analysis alone cannot fully account for the depth and persistence of women's oppression, which predates capitalism and exists even in societies with different economic systems. The reduction of women to the status of other, she suggests, has roots that extend deeper than any particular economic arrangement. What makes the second sex revolutionary is de Beauvoir's application of existentialist philosophy to the analysis of gender oppression. She shows how the existentialist concepts of freedom, situation, transcendence, and immanence provide powerful tools for understanding both how women have been oppressed and how liberation might be achieved. The key insight is that women have been systematically positioned in what de Beauvoir calls a situation of immanence, confined to the realm of repetitive biological and domestic functions that endlessly reproduce life without creating anything new, while men have been positioned in situations that allow for transcendence, the projection of consciousness beyond immediate circumstances toward future possibilities, and the creation of new meanings and values. This distinction between immanence and transcendence represents one of de Beauvoir's most important theoretical contributions. Human existence, she argues, necessarily involves both dimensions. As biological creatures, we are subject to cycles and processes that operate according to their own logic, largely independent of conscious control. We are born, we mature, we age, we die. Our bodies require constant maintenance through eating, sleeping, cleaning, sheltering from the elements. These biological necessities tie us to what de Beauvoir calls immanence, the endless repetition of life-maintaining activities that keep us alive but do not create new meanings or transform the world. But human beings are also conscious beings capable of transcendence, of projecting ourselves imaginatively beyond our immediate circumstances, of creating new meanings and values that did not previously exist, of transforming the natural and social world through projects that express our freedom. This capacity for transcendence is what makes us distinctively human rather than merely biological organisms. The problem, de Beauvoir shows, is that human societies have systematically assigned women to the realm of immanence, while reserving the realm of transcendence primarily for men. Women have been confined to the domestic sphere where they perform the endless repetitive labour of maintaining life, bearing and raising children, preparing food, cleaning, caring for the sick and elderly. This labour is absolutely necessary for human survival and social reproduction, but it is labour that must be done over and over again, that leaves no permanent mark on the world, that creates no new meanings or values. A meal prepared is eaten and must be prepared again. A room cleaned becomes dirty and must be cleaned again. A child raised grows up and has their own children, who must be raised in turn. The cycle continues endlessly without producing anything that transcends the immediate necessities of biological existence. Meanwhile, men have occupied the public sphere where transcendent projects are pursued, creating works of art and literature that express new visions and meanings, developing scientific theories that reveal the structure of reality, building political institutions that organize collective life, engaging in economic production that transforms natural resources into cultural artifacts, participating in religious and philosophical traditions that grapple with ultimate questions about existence and value. These activities, whatever their specific content, share the characteristic of transcendence. They project consciousness beyond immediate biological necessity toward the creation of meanings and transformations that endure beyond any individual life. De Beauvoir traces this division between immanence and transcendence, between domestic confinement and public engagement, through multiple domains of human culture. In mythology and religion, women appear as symbols of nature, matter, and the body, while men represent spirit, culture, and transcendence. In philosophy, women are associated with emotion, intuition, and particular experience, while men are identified with reason, analysis, and universal truth. In literature, women function primarily as objects of male desire or obstacles to male projects, rather than as subjects pursuing their own autonomous projects. In law and social custom, women are defined primarily through their relationships to men as daughters, wives, mothers, rather than as autonomous individuals with their own independent existence and value. But de Beauvoir's analysis goes beyond merely describing these patterns of oppression to investigate the mechanisms through which they are reproduced across generations. She shows how girls are socialized from earliest childhood to accept their position as other, to identify with the domestic realm of immanence, to derive their sense of worth from their attractiveness to men, and their capacity to serve others rather than from their own autonomous projects. Through thousands of subtle and not-so-subtle messages, girls learn to be passive rather than active, to accommodate rather than to demand, to serve rather than to create, to find satisfaction in being for others rather than in being for themselves. The analysis of feminine conditioning in the second sex remains one of the most psychologically acute accounts of how oppression operates not only through external constraint, but through the internalization of oppressive norms and values. Young girls learn to experience their own bodies as objects to be looked at and judged, rather than as instruments through which they act upon the world. They learn to monitor and discipline their behavior to conform to standards of feminine propriety that emphasize modesty, self-restraint, and attention to the needs and desires of others. They learn to channel their energies into making themselves attractive and pleasing rather than into developing their own capacities and pursuing their own projects. This process of feminine conditioning is so pervasive and begins so early that it comes to seem natural rather than constructed. Women themselves often cannot recognize the extent to which their supposedly free choices reflect internalized oppression, rather than authentic self-determination. The woman who chooses to devote herself entirely to domestic life and child-rearing believes she is following her natural maternal instincts, rather than conforming to social expectations that offer her few attractive alternatives. The woman who spends enormous time and resources on her appearance believes she is expressing her personal aesthetic preferences, rather than responding to a culture that values women primarily for their attractiveness to men. De Beauvoir's analysis of different life stages in women's lives reveals how feminine conditioning and social constraint operate differently at different points in the female life cycle, but always in ways that limit women's capacity for transcendence and autonomous self-creation. The young girl begins life with the same basic freedom and capacity for transcendence as the young boy, but she quickly encounters messages that her ambition should be limited, her energies channeled toward attracting a husband rather than developing her own talents and pursuing her own projects. The woman who marries finds that her identity becomes subsumed into her role as wife, expected to derive satisfaction from supporting her husband's projects rather than pursuing her own. The mother discovers that despite cultural glorification of motherhood, the actual work of raising children is exhausting, isolating, and provides little opportunity for the kind of transcendent projects that create enduring meaning and value. The older woman, who has devoted her life to serving her family, finds herself devalued and marginalized once her reproductive and sexual functions decline, left with neither the recognition that might come from public achievements, nor the intimate relationships that made her sacrifices seem meaningful. At every stage, women encounter structures and expectations that push them back into immanence, that prevent or discourage the transcendent projects through which human beings create meaning and realize their freedom. But the second sex is not merely a catalogue of oppression and complaint. De Beauvoir's analysis always maintains dual focus on both the reality of constraint and the possibility of freedom, both the mechanisms of oppression and the potential for liberation. She identifies and celebrates examples of women throughout history who managed to achieve transcendence despite the obstacles placed in their paths, artists and writers who created enduring works, scientists and intellectuals who made important discoveries, political leaders who shaped collective life, mystics and saints who developed profound spiritual insights. These exceptional women prove that women's confinement to immanence is not biologically necessary, but socially constructed, that women possess the same capacity for transcendence as men when given the opportunity to develop and exercise it. More importantly, de Beauvoir articulates a vision of women's liberation that goes beyond simply allowing a few exceptional women to escape into the male realm of transcendence while leaving the majority confined to immanence. True liberation requires transforming the relationship between immanence and transcendence for all human beings, creating social arrangements in which the necessary work of biological and social reproduction is shared between men and women and is integrated with, rather than opposed to, the transcendent projects through which human beings create meaning and realize freedom. It requires valuing care work and domestic labor not as inferior activities suitable only for women, but as essential human activities that should be organized in ways that allow those who perform them to also engage in transcendent projects. The path toward this liberation, de Beauvoir argues, requires changes at multiple levels simultaneously. Economic changes that give women access to meaningful paid work and economic independence from men. Political changes that grant women full citizenship and participation in collective decision-making. Legal changes that eliminate the formal disabilities that mark women as inferior. Educational changes that provide girls with the same opportunities as boys to develop their intellectual capacities. Cultural changes that transform the myths and symbols through which gender is understood and represented. And psychological changes through which both women and men learn to recognize and relate to women as full human subjects rather than as other. Part 5. Situation and Freedom. At the heart of Simone de Beauvoir's philosophical system lies a concept that mediates between the abstract freedom emphasized by existentialist philosophy and the concrete constraints emphasized by materialist analysis, the concept of situation. This concept, which de Beauvoir develops more fully and applies more systematically than any other existentialist thinker, provides the key to understanding how human freedom operates in the actual world rather than in the realm of pure philosophical abstraction. Situation names the complex ensemble of material, social, historical, and psychological factors that shape the field of possibilities within which any particular human being exercises their freedom. Understanding situation requires rejecting two opposite but equally mistaken views about the relationship between freedom and constraint. One view, which might be called abstract idealism, treats human freedom as absolute and unlimited, as if consciousness could simply choose to transcend any material or social circumstances through pure act of will. From this perspective, the slave is as free as the master, because both possess consciousness and the capacity to choose their attitude toward their circumstances. The oppressed person who fails to overcome their oppression has chosen their servitude and bears full responsibility for their condition. The opposite view, which might be called crude determinism, treats human beings as entirely products of their circumstances, shaped completely by biological, psychological, economic or social forces beyond their control. From this perspective, talk of human freedom is illusory, a comforting myth that obscures the reality that our thoughts, feelings and actions are determined by factors we neither choose nor control. The oppressed person who remains oppressed does so because their circumstances make liberation impossible, and attributing any responsibility to them for their condition amounts to blaming the victim. De Beauvoir shows how both views are mistaken because both fail to grasp the dialectical relationship between freedom and situation. Human freedom is real, but never absolute or unlimited. We are always situated freedom, consciousness operating within and through particular material and social circumstances that we did not choose and cannot entirely escape, but which we can interpret, navigate, and transform to varying degrees depending on the specific character of our situation. Freedom and situation are not external to each other, with freedom somehow existing apart from situation, or situation somehow eliminating freedom, but rather internally related aspects of the unified phenomenon that is human existence. The concept of situation allows de Beauvoir to acknowledge the reality of constraints without sliding into determinism, and to affirm human freedom without ignoring material and social realities. Someone born into extreme poverty faces constraints that, someone born into wealth does not face. The opportunities available to develop talents, pursue education, access meaningful work, participate in public life, even maintain basic health and survival, differ dramatically depending on economic circumstances. These differences are real and have profound consequences for what different people can actually do with their lives. To pretend that everyone is equally free regardless of their material circumstances is to engage in bad faith that serves to justify existing inequalities. But acknowledging these constraints does not mean that the person in poverty has no freedom or bears no responsibility for their choices. Even within severe constraints, some range of possible actions always remains available. Some choices must still be made. Some ways of responding to circumstances prove more or less effective in preserving dignity and pursuing whatever limited possibilities exist. The concept of situation allows us to recognize both that choices are real and consequential, and that the range and character of available choices differ dramatically depending on circumstances. De Beauvoir's analysis of situation reveals multiple dimensions that together constitute the complex field within which freedom operates. The biological dimension includes facts about our embodiment, our sex, our age, our health, our physical capacities and limitations. These biological facts are not destiny in any simple sense because their meaning and significance depend on how they are interpreted and what social structures and technological resources are available. But neither are they irrelevant or purely social constructions. The biological fact of pregnancy, for example, has different implications in a society with reliable contraception and legal abortion than in a society where women have no control over reproduction, but it remains a biological fact that shapes women's situation in ways that differ from men's situation. The economic dimension includes one's relationship to the means of production, one's access to resources necessary for survival and flourishing, one's position in systems of exchange and distribution. These economic factors powerfully shape the field of possibility within which freedom operates. Someone who must work long hours at exhausting labour simply to survive has less time and energy for education, political participation, creative pursuits, or relationship cultivation than someone whose basic needs are easily met. Economic inequality translates directly into inequality of freedom, into differences in the range of choices actually available to different people. The social dimension includes one's membership in various groups and communities, one's position in hierarchies of status and prestige, one's relationships with others who recognize and respond to one's actions. Human beings are social creatures whose identities and possibilities are shaped through relationships with others. The recognition we receive, or fail to receive from others, affects what we can become and what we can do. Someone who belongs to a stigmatized group faces constraints on their freedom that do not arise from their individual characteristics, but from how others perceive and respond to their group membership. The historical dimension includes the accumulated legacy of past actions and choices, both one's own personal history and the collective history of the communities and societies to which one belongs. We are born into worlds already shaped by countless prior choices, inheriting both achievements that expand possibility and injustices that constrain it. The meaning of present situations cannot be understood apart from this historical dimension. The situation of African Americans in the United States, for example, cannot be grasped without understanding the history of slavery, segregation, and ongoing racial discrimination that shapes present circumstances. The cultural dimension includes the systems of meaning, value, symbol, and practice through which human beings interpret their experience and organize their collective life. Language, religion, art, literature, philosophy, science all provide frameworks through which situations are understood and possibilities are imagined. These cultural resources are simultaneously enabling and constraining. They give us tools for understanding and acting, but also limit what we can think and do to what these frameworks make intelligible. The psychological dimension includes the individual's particular history, formed capacities, acquired habits, emotional tendencies, and characteristic ways of responding to situations. These psychological factors are neither purely individual nor purely social, but rather represent the internalization of social experiences that then shape how new situations are perceived and navigated. Someone who has been systematically discouraged from asserting themselves will experience greater difficulty claiming their freedom than someone who has been encouraged toward confidence and self-assertion, even if the external circumstances are otherwise similar. understanding freedom as situated freedom has profound implications for how we understand moral responsibility and ethical judgment. Simple moral absolutism that judges all actions by the same universal standards without regard to circumstances becomes untenable once we recognize how profoundly situation shapes what is actually possible for different people. The same action that might be morally obligatory for someone in favorable circumstances might be literally impossible for someone in severely constrained circumstances. Conversely, an action that appears problematic when performed by someone with many options might be fully justified when performed by someone with few alternatives. But de Beauvoir insists that acknowledging the role of situation in shaping possibility does not eliminate moral responsibility or reduce ethics to relativism. The fact that situations differ and that what is possible or advisable varies with circumstances does not mean that anything goes or that we cannot make moral judgments about actions and choices. Rather, it means that moral judgment must be situated judgment, evaluation that takes account of the actual circumstances within which choices are made rather than applying abstract principles without regard to context. This approach requires developing what de Beauvoir calls moral imagination, the capacity to understand situations from multiple perspectives, and to appreciate how circumstances shape what appears possible and desirable to differently situated people. Moral imagination does not mean abandoning moral standards or treating all choices as equally valid, but rather recognizing that moral evaluation requires careful attention to particularity rather than simple subsumption of cases under general rules. It requires asking not only what someone did, but also what their situation was, what alternatives were actually available to them, what they could reasonably have been expected to know and foresee, how their actions related to larger structures and patterns beyond individual control. De Beauvoir's concept of situation also provides resources for understanding the relationship between individual and collective action, between personal transformation and social change. Individuals cannot simply will themselves free regardless of their circumstances, but neither must they wait passively for circumstances to change through forces beyond their control. Instead, situated freedom means that individuals can act to transform their situations within the limits of what their current circumstances make possible, creating new possibilities for themselves and others that did not previously exist. This transformation often requires collective action, because situations are largely social constructions that cannot be changed by isolated individuals acting alone. The situation of women, for example, is not something any individual woman can fully escape through her own efforts because it is maintained by institutions, laws, customs, economic structures, and cultural meanings that exceed individual control. Changing women's situation requires collective action by women and men together to transform these structures and create new possibilities for how women and men relate to each other and organize their lives. But collective action itself requires individuals to recognize their situation as changeable rather than natural or inevitable, to imagine alternatives to existing arrangements, to commit themselves to projects of transformation despite uncertainty about outcomes. This means that even under oppressive circumstances, even when structural change seems remote or impossible, individual exercises of freedom matter because they keep alive the possibility of transformation and contribute to creating the conditions under which more fundamental change can occur. Part 6. Existential Ethics and Political Commitment. The movement from de Beauvoir's abstract philosophical analysis to concrete political engagement exemplifies one of her most important contributions to existentialist thought, the demonstration that existentialist philosophy not only permits, but requires active political commitment to projects of human liberation. Where some critics had argued that existentialism's emphasis on individual freedom and subjective choice logically led to political quietism or nihilistic withdrawal from collective life, de Beauvoir showed how authentic assumption of freedom necessarily entails engagement with political struggles against oppression and for expanded human possibility. This connection between existential ethics and political commitment flows from de Beauvoir's recognition that freedom is not an isolated individual possession, but a relational phenomenon that can only be realized through and with others. As we have seen, willing one's own freedom logically entails willing the freedom of others, because freedom in isolation is meaningless, an abstract possibility that cannot be concretely realized in a world where others are enslaved or oppressed. But this recognition immediately raises the question of how to respond to actual situations where some human beings' freedom is systematically constrained by social structures, institutions, and practices that serve the interests of dominant groups. De Beauvoir's answer is that authentic existential ethics requires active opposition to oppression in all its forms, commitment to creating social conditions that expand the range of possibility available to all human beings, and willingness to take risks and make sacrifices in service of collective liberation. This is not an arbitrary addition to existentialist philosophy, but follows directly from proper understanding of what freedom is and what it requires. Someone who claims to value freedom while remaining indifferent to or complicit in structures that deny freedom to others engages in the worst form of bad faith, using the language of freedom to justify what is actually a refusal of genuine freedom and responsibility. But de Beauvoir also recognized that political commitment raises difficult ethical questions that cannot be resolved through simple application of abstract principles. Politics inevitably involves working with imperfect knowledge, uncertain outcomes, conflicting values, and the tragic reality that not all goods can be simultaneously realized. The same action that expands freedom for one group may constrain it for another, at least in the short term. The use of force to resist oppression may be necessary, but also risks reproducing the violence it opposes. The creation of collective movements requires organization and discipline that can constrain individual autonomy even while serving the larger goal of liberation. These tensions cannot be eliminated through better theory or more careful analysis, but must be negotiated through concrete choices made in specific historical situations. De Beauvoir's approach to these ethical complexities reflects what she calls the wisdom of ambiguity, the recognition that political action always occurs in conditions of uncertainty, and that even our best efforts may produce unintended consequences, or fail to achieve their objectives. This does not counsel paralysis or withdrawal, but rather calls for a particular kind of political engagement, characterized by commitment without dogmatism, principled action without moral absolutism, and willingness to accept responsibility for outcomes while acknowledging the limits of what we can control. Her own political commitments evolved over decades of active engagement with the major political struggles of the 20th century. During the Nazi occupation of France, de Beauvoir and Sartre participated in the resistance, though their contribution was primarily intellectual rather than military. This experience of living under totalitarian oppression gave concrete urgency to abstract philosophical questions about freedom, responsibility, and collective action. It demonstrated how quickly apparently stable democratic institutions could collapse, and how individual choices under extreme circumstances could have life and death consequences, not only for oneself, but for others whose lives became entangled with one's own. The post-war period confronted de Beauvoir with questions about political violence and revolutionary change that would occupy her attention for decades. The crimes of Stalinism became increasingly impossible to ignore or explain away, forcing painful recognition that movements claiming to serve human liberation could themselves become instruments of oppression and terror. The wars of decolonization, particularly the Algerian War of Independence, raised questions about whether violence could be justified in struggles against colonial domination, and whether intellectuals in colonizing nations had obligations to actively oppose their own government's policies. De Beauvoir's response to these questions exemplifies her characteristic refusal of easy answers and her insistence on maintaining tension between competing ethical principles. She recognized the justice of colonized peoples' struggles for independence and supported those struggles even when they involved violence. But she also insisted that violence, even when justified by circumstances, remains a tragic necessity rather than something to be celebrated or glorified. The use of force in resisting oppression may be necessary when all other options have been foreclosed, but it always carries moral costs and risks, perpetuating cycles of violence that can undermine the very liberation being sought. Her analysis of political violence reflects the fundamental structure of her ethics of ambiguity. In an ideal world, all conflicts could be resolved through rational dialogue and mutual recognition. But we do not live in an ideal world. We live in a world scarred by centuries of oppression, structured by profound inequalities, characterized by entrenched interests that will not voluntarily relinquish power or privilege. In such a world, those who suffer oppression cannot simply wait patiently for their oppressors to recognize their humanity and grant them freedom. they must act to create the conditions for their own liberation, even when such action requires force. But recognizing that violence may sometimes be necessary does not mean abandoning moral judgment about when and how force is used, or treating all uses of violence as equally justified. De Beauvoir insists on maintaining moral discrimination even in extreme situations, evaluating political violence by whether it genuinely serves liberation or merely expresses rage and resentment, whether it targets those responsible for oppression or indiscriminately harms innocents, whether it remains proportionate to its objectives or escalates beyond what circumstances require, whether it maintains connection to positive vision of a more free and just world or becomes an end in itself. Her commitment to women's liberation deepened throughout her life, evolving from the philosophical analysis of the second sex to active involvement in feminist movements that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. Initially, de Beauvoir had maintained some distance from organized feminist activism, believing that women's liberation would be achieved primarily through individual women claiming their freedom and through socialist transformation that would eliminate the economic foundations of gender oppression. But she came to recognize that women's liberation required autonomous feminist movements that could address forms of oppression not reducible to economic exploitation, and that collective action by women was necessary to transform the institutions and cultural meanings that sustained gender hierarchy. Her involvement with the Mouvement de Libération des Femmes in France exemplifies her commitment to connecting philosophical analysis with practical political work. She lent her considerable prestige and intellectual authority to campaigns for reproductive rights, particularly the legalization of abortion and contraception. She signed the famous Manifesto of the 343, a public declaration by French women that they had obtained illegal abortions, risking prosecution to challenge laws that forced women to risk their lives in clandestine procedures or bear unwanted children. She participated in demonstrations, gave interviews, wrote articles, and used every platform available to her to advance women's liberation. But de Beauvoir's feminism was never narrowly focused on women's issues in isolation from other forms of oppression and other struggles for liberation. She insisted on what would later be called an intersectional approach, recognizing that gender oppression intersects with class exploitation, racial domination, colonial, subjugation, and other systems of hierarchy that together constitute the complex reality of actually existing oppression. Women's liberation could not be achieved independently of struggles against capitalism, racism, and imperialism because these systems of domination reinforce each other and because women experience oppression differently depending on their positions within multiple hierarchies. This recognition led de Beauvoir to support a wide range of political movements and causes throughout her life. She opposed the Vietnam War and American imperialism more broadly, recognizing how colonial and neo-colonial domination created and sustained underdevelopment that condemned millions to lives of poverty and constraint. She supported the civil rights movement in the United States and anti-racist struggles in France and elsewhere, understanding how racial hierarchy restricts freedom for those subjected to it while corrupting the humanity of those who benefit from it. She advocated for nuclear disarmament, recognizing how the threat of total annihilation constrained human possibility and distorted political life. Her political engagements were not always consistent or free from error. She sometimes defended Soviet policy longer than evidence warranted, reluctant to abandon faith in socialism despite accumulating evidence of totalitarian oppression in actually existing socialist states. She sometimes underestimated the depth of divisions between different liberation movements and overestimated the likelihood that they would spontaneously unite in common struggle against all forms of oppression. She sometimes failed to fully appreciate forms of oppression that fell outside her own experience and theoretical framework. But what makes de Beauvoir's political engagement exemplary is not that she always got everything right, but rather that she remained committed to learning from experience, revising her positions in light of new evidence and understanding, and maintaining the courage to take positions and act on them, despite uncertainty about outcomes. Her political life exemplifies the ethics of ambiguity in practice, showing how commitment and flexibility, principle and pragmatism, idealism and realism can be held together in productive tension, rather than treated as mutually exclusive alternatives. De Beauvoir's analysis of the relationship between intellectuals and politics provides important guidance for understanding the particular responsibilities and limitations of those whose primary work involves ideas, rather than direct political organizing or institutional power. She rejected both the view that intellectuals should remain detached from political struggles to preserve their objectivity, and the view that intellectuals should simply place themselves at the service of revolutionary movements without exercising independent critical judgment. Instead, she argued for what might be called engaged independence, active political commitment combined with maintenance of critical perspective that allows intellectuals to contribute what is distinctive about intellectual work: careful analysis, historical perspective, ability to articulate principles and draw connections that may not be immediately visible to those immersed in day-to-day political struggle. The intellectual's political responsibility includes using their skills and platforms to analyze systems of oppression, to articulate visions of more just alternatives, to defend values and principles that political expediency might sacrifice, to maintain memory of past struggles and lessons learned, and to subject their own side to criticism when it betrays stated principles or employs problematic means. But intellectual work alone is never sufficient for achieving political transformation. Ideas matter, but they must be connected to movements capable of translating insight into institutional change and new practices. Intellectuals serve liberation best not by imagining themselves as vanguards who will lead masses to freedom, but by contributing what they can while recognizing the limits of what ideas alone can accomplish. Part 7. Old Age and the Existential Confrontation with Mortality. In 1970, at the age of 62, Simone de Beauvoir published another groundbreaking work of existential phenomenology and social criticism, The Coming of Age. This comprehensive study of aging and old age in Western societies applies the same analytical framework she had developed in The Second Sex to another form of oppression that had received little serious philosophical attention: the marginalization and devaluation of elderly people in societies that worship youth and productivity. The book demonstrates how existentialist philosophy can illuminate dimensions of human existence that traditional philosophy had largely ignored or treated only abstractly, and it shows how social criticism grounded in phenomenological description can reveal forms of oppression that become invisible precisely through their normalization. De Beauvoir's motivation for writing about old age reflected both intellectual commitment to comprehensive understanding of human existence and personal confrontation with her own aging. She had watched her mother's decline and death, an experience she had explored in her memoir A Very Easy Death, and she was beginning to experience the physical and social changes that come with aging. But rather than treating old age purely as a personal problem to be endured with dignity, she recognized it as a social and philosophical problem that revealed fundamental features of how societies organize human life and how individuals relate to their own temporality and mortality. The existential dimension of aging concerns the confrontation with finitude that becomes increasingly unavoidable as one ages. When young, death remains an abstract possibility that seems remote enough to be largely ignored in day-to-day existence. The future appears open and unlimited, stretching forward as a field of infinite possibility. Projects can be undertaken with confidence that there will be time to complete them. Relationships can be formed with expectation that they will endure. Mistakes can be made with assurance that there will be opportunities for correction and new beginnings. But aging progressively closes down this sense of unlimited futurity. The horizon of possibility contracts as time remaining becomes less than time already lived. Physical capacities decline, making some activities that were previously taken for granted difficult or impossible. Energy diminishes, making it necessary to choose more carefully how to allocate limited resources. Friends and contemporaries die, removing some of the relationships that gave life meaning and reminding one of one's own mortality. The awareness that one's own death is no longer a remote abstraction, but an approaching reality can no longer be evaded through the busyness and distraction that allowed death to remain in the background of consciousness during youth and middle age. This confrontation with finitude could be interpreted as purely negative as the progressive loss of possibility and approach of nothingness. Indeed, Western culture typically frames aging in precisely these terms, as decline, deterioration, loss of vitality and relevance. The elderly are seen as past their prime, as having been rather than still becoming, as representing what we will lose rather than what we might gain through the experience of aging. This cultural narrative encourages both young and old to regard aging with fear and contempt. leading elderly people themselves to internalize negative valuations and experience their own aging as shameful diminishment. But de Beauvoir shows how this interpretation of aging reflects social construction rather than existential necessity. While the biological facts of physical decline are real and cannot be denied, the meaning of these facts depends on how they are interpreted and what possibilities remain available despite physical changes. In societies that value only productivity and physical vitality, aging necessarily appears as pure loss because elderly people can no longer contribute in the ways that are socially valued. But in societies that value wisdom, experience, perspective, and the transmission of cultural traditions, aging can represent gain as much as loss, accumulation of understanding, and deepened capacity for judgment that only come with long experience. De Beauvoir's analysis reveals how contemporary capitalist societies systematically devalue and marginalize elderly people through economic, social, and cultural mechanisms that combine to create what amounts to structured oppression. Economically, mandatory retirement policies remove elderly people from productive work and reduce them to dependence on pensions that typically provide far less income than they earned while working. This economic marginalization carries the message that elderly people have nothing valuable to contribute and should accept their removal from active participation in economic life. Socially, elderly people are segregated in retirement communities, nursing homes, and other age-specific institutions that separate them from the broader community and prevent the intergenerational contact through which wisdom and experience could be transmitted. This segregation serves the convenience of younger adults who prefer not to be confronted with the reality of aging and death, but it impoverishes both young and old by preventing the relationships and exchanges that could enrich life at all ages. Culturally, images and narratives about aging emphasize decline and decrepitude, presenting old age as something to be feared and avoided, rather than as a natural stage of human life that brings its own possibilities and satisfactions. The elderly themselves are rarely represented as complex individuals with their own projects, desires, and perspectives, but rather appear as burdens, as figures of pity or contempt, as warnings about what awaits all who are lucky enough to avoid premature death. The consequences of this systematic devaluation of old age are profound for both individuals and society. Elderly people who internalize these negative messages lose confidence in their own value and withdraw from active engagement with life, accepting the role of passive dependence rather than continuing to pursue projects and relationships that give meaning to existence. Society loses access to the accumulated wisdom and experience of its older members, forcing each generation to rediscover through painful trial and error what previous generations had already learned. The young, who will themselves become old if they live long enough, develop anxious dread about their own aging rather than understanding it as a transition that can be navigated with grace and dignity. But de Beauvoir's analysis also identifies sources of resistance to these oppressive patterns and possibilities for alternative approaches to aging. Some elderly people refuse to accept cultural scripts that define them as useless and irrelevant, continuing to pursue projects, maintain relationships, and contribute to collective life in whatever ways remain available to them. Some cultures and communities have maintained traditions that honor elderly people and create roles through which they can continue to participate meaningfully in social life. Some individuals and movements have begun to challenge ageist assumptions and advocate for policies and practices that would enable elderly people to maintain autonomy and dignity rather than being forced into dependence and marginalization. The existential approach to aging that de Beauvoir articulates focuses not on denying the reality of physical decline and approaching death, but on finding ways to maintain authentic engagement with life, even as possibilities contract and death approaches. This requires facing mortality honestly rather than evading it through denial or distraction, accepting the limits that aging imposes while continuing to exercise whatever freedom remains available, finding meaning in present experience rather than living entirely for a future that becomes progressively more limited, and maintaining relationships with others who recognize one's continued humanity and subjectivity despite physical decline. Her analysis also extends to the specific situation of women in old age, showing how aging affects women differently than men due to the different ways gender is constructed and valued. Because women have been valued primarily for youth, beauty, and reproductive capacity, the loss of these attributes through aging represents more devastating social death for women than for men, who have been valued more for achievements and social status that can persist into old age. An aging man may be seen as distinguished, mature, experienced, while an aging woman is simply old, past her prime, no longer attractive or relevant. This differential impact of aging reveals once again how women's oppression operates across the entire life course, not merely during the years of youth and reproductive capacity. The girl who is taught to value herself primarily for her appearance and her capacity to attract male attention becomes the woman who experiences aging as progressive loss of value and relevance. The woman who has been encouraged to find satisfaction, primarily through relationships with husband and children, discovers in old age that these relationships may not provide the meaning and purpose they seem to promise. The woman who has been discouraged from developing her own projects and pursuing her own ambitions finds in old age that she has nothing to fall back on when domestic roles decline in importance. But some women, particularly those who have managed to pursue their own projects and maintain independence, despite social pressures toward domestic confinement, find that aging brings certain freedoms. Released from pressures to maintain youthful appearance and to accommodate others' demands and expectations, some older women experience new liberty to speak freely, to prioritize their own needs and desires, to pursue projects without concern for how others will judge them. This suggests that women's aging need not be experienced purely as loss if women have been able to develop selves that are not entirely defined by their relationships to others or their conformity to standards of feminine attractiveness. De Beauvoir's own aging exemplifies some of the possibilities she identified for maintaining authentic existence despite physical decline and approaching death. She continued to write, to engage politically, to maintain relationships, to travel and experience new things, to think and create until very near the end of her life. Her late works, including the volumes of autobiography and the collection of interviews published as Adieu, A Farewell to Sartre, show a mind still actively grappling with questions about meaning, memory, mortality, and the evaluation of a life lived with remarkable consciousness and commitment. The existential significance of aging extends beyond the individual experience to illuminate fundamental features of human temporality and the relationship between past, present, and future in the constitution of human existence. When young, we live primarily oriented toward the future, toward possibilities not yet realized, toward the person we might become through our choices and projects. The past seems less important, something to be escaped or transcended rather than something that constitutes who we are. But as we age and the future contracts, the past takes on greater significance. We become the accumulation of our choices and experiences, carrying within ourselves the story of who we have been and what we have done. This shift in temporal orientation can be experienced as confinement, as being trapped by a past that cannot be changed, burdened by regrets about roads not taken and mistakes not corrected. But it can also be experienced as achievement, as having created something through one's life that now exists as an accomplished fact, no longer subject to the anxiety of possibility that characterizes youth. The elderly person looking back on their life can see patterns and meanings that were not visible while living through the particular moments that now constitute their personal history. They can evaluate what they have made of their freedom, assess whether the projects they pursued were worthy, judge whether they used their opportunities well or squandered them in pursuit of false values. Part 8. Literature and Philosophy. Throughout Simone de Beauvoir's career, the relationship between literature and philosophy remained not merely a practical question about how to communicate ideas, but a theoretical problem about the relationship between different forms of knowledge and expression. Unlike many philosophers who relegated literature to the status of illustration or popularization of ideas more rigorously developed in philosophical treatises, de Beauvoir insisted that literary form provides access to dimensions of human experience that cannot be adequately captured through purely conceptual analysis. Fiction, memoir, and philosophical essay each illuminate different aspects of existence, and complete understanding requires all these forms working together rather than treating one as authoritative and others as derivative. The philosophical foundation for de Beauvoir's integration of literature and philosophy lies in her phenomenological approach to human existence. Phenomenology, as developed by Husserl and elaborated by existentialist thinkers, insists on beginning philosophical analysis with careful description of actual lived experience in all its concrete particularity rather than with abstract concepts or theoretical models. But lived experience always occurs in specific situations, involves particular individuals with distinctive histories and characteristics, unfolds through time in ways that give it narrative structure, and possesses emotional and qualitative dimensions that resist capture in purely conceptual language. Literature, de Beauvoir recognized, provides tools for representing these concrete particularities of lived experience in ways that philosophical discourse cannot match. A character in a novel exists in specific circumstances, possesses particular traits and history, faces concrete choices with real consequences, experiences the ambiguity and uncertainty that characterize actual human existence. Readers can vicariously experience the situations that fictional characters inhabit, feel the emotional textures of their experiences, follow the development of their consciousness through time, and grasp the meanings that emerge through narrative rather than being stated as explicit propositions. De Beauvoir's novels demonstrate how literary form can explore philosophical questions while remaining true to the complexity and ambiguity of actual human situations. She Came to Stay, her first novel, investigates questions about consciousness, freedom, and interpersonal relationships through a narrative that captures the psychological dynamics and emotional textures of a triangular relationship. The characters are not mere illustrations of philosophical concepts, but fully realized individuals whose particular circumstances and personalities shape how they experience and respond to the existential dilemmas they confront. The Blood of Others explores questions about individual responsibility for collective outcomes, about whether and how we can be held responsible for consequences of our actions that extend far beyond our intentions, about the relationship between personal morality and political action. Set during the Nazi occupation of France, the novel shows how ordinary people making what seem like small personal choices find themselves implicated in larger patterns of collaboration or resistance whose moral meanings only become clear in retrospect. All Men Are Mortal uses the device of an immortal protagonist to explore questions about mortality, temporality, and the relationship between individual existence and historical change. By imagining someone who cannot die and who has lived through centuries of human history, de Beauvoir illuminates by contrast what mortality means for ordinary human beings, how the fact that we will die shapes the meaning of our choices and relationships, how historical change appears different from the perspective of immortal consciousness versus finite existence embedded in particular historical moments. The Mandarins, perhaps her most accomplished novel, examines the situation of left-wing intellectuals in post-war France grappling with questions about political commitment, personal relationships, and the responsibility of writers and thinkers in a world scarred by fascism and threatened by new forms of totalitarianism. The novel captures the texture of intellectual and bohemian life in Paris during a crucial historical moment, while also exploring timeless questions about authenticity, bad faith, freedom, and responsibility that had occupied de Beauvoir's philosophical attention throughout her career. But de Beauvoir's literary work extends beyond fiction to include memoir and autobiography, forms that occupy an ambiguous position between literature and philosophy, between personal testimony and general insight. Her multi-volume autobiography, beginning with Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter and continuing through 3 subsequent volumes, provides not only an account of her own life, but also a phenomenological description of what it meant to live as an intellectual woman in 20th century France, navigating between traditional expectations and emerging possibilities, working out in concrete existence the philosophical insights she developed more abstractly in her theoretical works. The power of these autobiographical works lies in their combination of personal honesty and analytical distance. De Beauvoir writes about her own experience with remarkable candour, revealing not only external events but also internal struggles, doubts, failures, and evolving understanding. Yet she simultaneously maintains enough critical perspective to locate her individual experience within larger social and historical patterns, showing how her particular life exemplifies more general structures and possibilities of human existence in specific historical situations. This integration of personal and universal, particular and general, concrete and abstract exemplifies what de Beauvoir meant by existentialist literature. Such literature does not use fictional characters as mere vehicles for illustrating preformed philosophical ideas, but rather discovers philosophical insights through careful attention to the concrete particularities of individual existence in specific situations. The movement is not from philosophical concept to literary illustration, but from literary exploration to philosophical understanding, with fiction providing a kind of experimentation with possibilities that can reveal features of existence not accessible through purely abstract analysis. De Beauvoir's critical writings on literature, collected in various essays and reviews, articulate her understanding of what makes literature philosophically significant. She values writers who attend carefully to the concrete realities of human existence, who resist the temptation to impose false order or premature resolution on the ambiguities and conflicts that characterize actual experience, who remain faithful to the complexity of consciousness and the opacity of other minds. She criticizes writers who use literature for didactic purposes, who subordinate character and situation to ideological messages, who sacrifice psychological truth to political correctness or commercial appeal. Her reading of other existentialist writers, particularly Sartre and Camus, reveals both deep appreciation for what they accomplished and critical awareness of their limitations. She valued Sartre's Nausea for its phenomenological description of consciousness, confronting the absurdity and contingency of existence, his Roads to Freedom trilogy for its exploration of freedom and commitment in the approach to World War II. She appreciated Camus' ability to capture the existential situation of modern humanity in The Stranger and the Plague. But she also recognized ways that both writers sometimes allowed philosophical preoccupations to constrain their literary imaginations or failed to fully inhabit the perspectives of female characters who remained somewhat external to their male protagonists' subjectivity. Her analysis of earlier literature, particularly 19th century novels, shows how existentialist insights about human freedom, bad faith, and authentic existence can illuminate works written before existentialism emerged as explicit philosophical movement. She found in writers like Stendhal and Dostoevsky profound understanding of consciousness and freedom, recognition of the opacity of other minds and the difficulty of authentic intersubjectivity, awareness of how social position shapes possibility without absolutely determining it. But de Beauvoir also recognized that not all important human truths can be expressed through literature, just as not all can be captured in philosophical discourse. Some forms of understanding require systematic conceptual analysis, rigorous logical argument, comprehensive theoretical frameworks that can only be developed through traditional philosophical methods. Literature complements philosophy but does not replace it, just as philosophy complements literature without making it unnecessary. The goal should be integration rather than reduction, maintaining multiple modes of inquiry and expression that together provide more complete understanding than any single approach could achieve alone. The relationship between de Beauvoir's literary and philosophical work raises questions about how to evaluate her achievement. Should she be judged primarily as a philosopher who also wrote fiction, or as a novelist who happened to have philosophical interests? The question itself embodies a false dichotomy that de Beauvoir's career challenges. She was both novelist and philosopher, and her contributions to each domain were enhanced by her work in the other. Her philosophical insights gained concreteness and accessibility through literary expression, while her fiction achieved depth and significance through engagement with fundamental questions about existence, freedom, and ethics. Contemporary readers sometimes encounter difficulty with de Beauvoir's literary works because they resist conventional expectations about what fiction should do. Her novels include long passages of philosophical reflection. Her characters engage in intellectual debates about abstract ideas. Her narratives sometimes seem to privilege thought over action. But these features reflect not literary failure, but different literary aims. De Beauvoir sought to represent the reality of human consciousness as it actually operates for thinking beings, which includes abstract reflection, as well as sensory experience, philosophical questioning, as well as emotional response, intellectual dialogue, as well as physical action. The enduring value of de Beauvoir's literary philosophical integration lies in its demonstration that the division between different forms of inquiry and expression, between thinking and feeling, between analysis and imagination, represents not a necessary feature of how knowledge must be pursued, but a conventional separation that can be challenged and overcome. Her example suggests possibilities for new forms of writing that integrate what academic specialization typically separates, that speak to both mind and heart, that combine rigorous analysis with rich imagination, that honor both the particular and the universal dimensions of human existence. Part 9. The Scandal of Contingency. At the centre of Simone de Beauvoir's philosophical vision lies recognition of what she calls the fundamental contingency of human existence. We are beings who did not have to exist, who exist in forms we did not choose, who inhabit situations we did not create, yet who are absolutely responsible for what we make of these unchosen circumstances. This contingency extends from the largest metaphysical questions about why there is something rather than nothing, to the most intimate personal questions about identity, meaning, and value. Understanding the full significance of contingency and learning to affirm existence, despite its contingent character, represents one of the central challenges of authentic human existence. The philosophical concept of contingency contrasts with necessity. Something is necessary if it could not possibly be otherwise, if its existence or character follows logically from its nature or from laws that govern reality. Something is contingent if it could have been otherwise or might not have existed at all, if there is no reason beyond brute fact that explains why it is as it is rather than different or non-existent. Traditional Western philosophy and theology had typically sought to ground human existence and human values in some necessary foundation that would guarantee their reality and significance. God, reason, human nature, natural law, historical progress all served at various times as supposedly necessary foundations that would rescue human existence from the scandal of pure contingency. But de Beauvoir's existentialist philosophy begins from recognition that all these attempts to discover or create necessary foundations ultimately fail. There is no God whose existence is necessary, and whose will grounds human existence and values. There is no rational order inherent in reality that human reason can discover and conform to. There is no fixed human nature that determines what human beings are or should become. There are no natural laws or historical patterns that guarantee progress or provide objective standards for evaluating human choices. Human existence and human values are through and through contingent, resting on no foundation beyond the choices human beings make within the situations into which they are thrown. This recognition could provoke what existentialist philosophers call nausea or absurdity, visceral disgust at the groundlessness of existence, the dizzying awareness that nothing has to be as it is, that we could cease to exist as easily as we came to exist, that all our meanings and values are human constructions that could vanish without the universe missing them. Sartre had explored this dimension of existential experience in his novel Nausea, describing the protagonist's overwhelming sense of the superfluity and arbitrariness of existence when he suddenly perceives the world stripped of the comfortable meanings and categories through which we normally navigate. Reality. De Beauvoir acknowledges this dimension of existential experience but refuses to treat it as the final word about the human condition. Yes, our existence is contingent and our values are constructed rather than discovered. Yes, we could cease to exist, and the universe would continue indifferently. Yes, the meanings we create through our projects rest on no foundation beyond our commitment to them. But none of this implies that existence is meaningless, or that values are arbitrary, or that there are no genuine differences between better and worse ways of living. The key lies in recognizing that the opposite of contingency is not meaning but necessity, and that meaning does not require necessity in order to be genuine. Human life has the meanings we give it through our choices and commitments, meanings that are real and significant despite being contingent, despite resting on no foundation beyond human freedom. The fact that we could have chosen differently does not make our actual choices meaningless. The fact that our values are constructed rather than discovered does not make them arbitrary or worthless. The fact that our projects might fail and our meanings might be forgotten does not make them pointless or futile while they exist and orient our lives. De Beauvoir shows how accepting contingency, without falling into nihilism or despair, requires what she calls metaphysical conversion, transformation in how we understand the relationship between existence and meaning, between freedom and value, between contingency and significance. This conversion involves abandoning the assumption that meaning must be guaranteed by something outside human existence, and recognizing that human beings are the sources of meaning in an existence that provides no inherent meaning. It involves accepting that freedom is both burden and gift, both the source of anguish because we must choose without guarantees, and the source of possibility because we can create meanings that did not previously exist. This metaphysical conversion parallels in philosophical register the psychological conversion that de Beauvoir analyzes in concrete existential terms. both involve moving from what she calls the spirit of seriousness to authentic freedom. The serious person treats their values and projects as if they were objectively grounded, as if they were discovering rather than creating meaning, as if their commitments reflected necessities rather than choices. This seriousness provides psychological comfort by disguising the contingency and groundlessness of existence, but it does so through bad faith that denies the freedom and responsibility that constitute our humanity. Authentic existence requires facing contingency honestly, while continuing to commit ourselves to projects and values we recognize as contingent. This creates what de Beauvoir calls productive tension. We know our values are constructed rather than discovered, yet we commit ourselves to them as if they were absolute. We recognize that our projects might fail, yet we pursue them with full engagement. We understand that we could have chosen differently, yet we take responsibility for the choices we actually made as genuinely ours. This tension between recognizing contingency and maintaining commitment cannot be eliminated or resolved, but must be sustained throughout a life of authentic freedom. The social dimension of contingency adds further complexity to these existential questions. Not only is my individual existence contingent, but the social world into which I am born is also contingent, could have been organized differently, embodies no eternal necessity. The institutions, practices, values, meanings, and hierarchies that structure my situation are historical human creations that arose through complex chains of events that could have unfolded differently. This contingency of the social world means that it can be changed through human action, that no arrangement is so natural or necessary that it must be accepted as given. But recognizing the contingency of social arrangements does not automatically reveal what changes should be made or how to make them. Just as individual freedom exists within situations that constrain it, social change operates within historical contexts that limit what is possible at any given moment. De Beauvoir rejects both utopian fantasies that imagine perfect societies that would eliminate all constraints and conflicts, and cynical resignation that treats existing arrangements as unchangeable. Instead, she advocates what might be called realistic idealism, recognition that significant improvement is possible even if perfection is not, that incremental changes can accumulate into fundamental transformation, that existing arrangements embody no eternal necessity even if they cannot be instantly transcended. The ethical implications of contingency center on the relationship between freedom and value. If values are constructed rather than discovered, if they rest on no foundation beyond human choices, then how can we distinguish better from worse values, ethical from unethical choices, progress from regression? De Beauvoir's answer is that the contingency of values does not make them arbitrary because they are constructed through freedom, and freedom itself provides a substantive criterion for evaluation. Values and social arrangements that expand human freedom are better than those that constrain it. Choices that affirm both one's own freedom and the freedom of others are ethical, while those that deny or restrict freedom are unethical. But this criterion itself rests on no foundation beyond the nature of human existence as freedom. There is no external authority that could compel someone to value freedom or demonstrate logically that they must value it. Someone who genuinely preferred to freedom, domination to liberation, could not be refuted through philosophical argument alone. De Beauvoir's ethics, thus, remains ultimately existential rather than foundational. It articulates principles that follow from authentic assumption of human freedom, but it cannot prove that one must authentically assume one's freedom rather than fleeing from it through bad faith. This frank acknowledgement that existentialist ethics cannot be grounded in foundations that would compel rational assent from all possible perspectives represents honesty about the contingency and groundlessness of existence, rather than weakness in the philosophical system. The search for absolute foundations that could ground ethical principles independently of human choice reflects the spirit of seriousness, the refusal to accept responsibility for creating values rather than discovering them. Existentialist ethics embraces the contingency and constructed character of values while showing how authentic values can be distinguished from inauthentic ones, how genuine freedom can be distinguished from false freedom, how liberation can be distinguished from new forms of oppression. The aesthetic dimension of contingency appears in de Beauvoir's understanding of how art and literature create meaning through form. A great work of art or literature transforms contingent materials elements that could have been combined in infinite other ways into a coherent whole that achieves necessity through its internal relationships and achieved form. The words in a great poem could have been used to write something else, but once combined into this particular poem, they achieve a kind of necessity, a rightness that makes alternatives seem wrong, even though they remain logically possible. Art thus exemplifies how contingent freedom can create genuine meaning and value through its own constructive activity. Human life at its best possesses this same aesthetic quality, contingent elements transformed through choices and commitments into coherent narrative that achieves meaning through its form and development. We are given certain capacities, born into particular situations, face specific opportunities and constraints that we did not choose. These elements are contingent, could have been otherwise. But through the choices we make in response to them, we create lives that possess meaning and value not despite, but through their contingency. The life well lived is like a great work of art. Its materials were contingent, but what it becomes through their integration achieves a necessity that vindicates the freedom that created it. Part 10. Memory, Narrative and Historical Understanding. Simone de Beauvoir's philosophical engagement with questions of memory and narrative reveals another dimension of her systematic effort to understand human existence in its full temporality. Human beings are historical creatures whose present existence incorporates a past that cannot be changed and projects toward a future that does not yet exist. How we remember and narrate our past powerfully shapes who we understand ourselves to be in the present and what we imagine as possible in the future. Yet memory and narrative are not simply neutral recordings of fact, but active processes of selection, interpretation, and meaning construction that raise complex questions about truth, identity, and historical understanding. The philosophical investigation of memory had traditionally focused on epistemological questions about how memory provides knowledge of the past and whether such knowledge can be reliable. Descartes had worried that perhaps all his supposed memories were false, implanted by an evil demon, rather than representing actual past experiences. Hume had analysed how we construct beliefs about causal relationships through repeated observations that we remember and generalise. Bergson had distinguished between different forms of memory and explored how temporal consciousness operates. De Beauvoir's approach to memory builds on these philosophical analyses while transforming them through existentialist and phenomenological insights. She recognises that memory is not merely a capacity for storing and retrieving information about the past, but a fundamental dimension of how human consciousness constitutes itself through time. We exist as beings with history, as creatures whose present identity incorporates and depends upon a past that we carry forward even when we are not explicitly remembering it. This past is not merely behind us, something we have left behind in moving forward toward the future, but rather continues to exist as a dimension of our present being. But the past as it is remembered and incorporated into present identity differs from the past as it was actually lived. Memory is selective, preserving some experiences while allowing others to fade or disappear. Memory is interpretive, understanding past events in light of everything that has happened since and from perspectives that may differ radically from those we held when living through the events. Memory is reconstructive, actively building narratives about who we were and what happened, rather than passively recording objective facts. And memory is motivated, serving present psychological needs and identity construction projects that may require emphasizing certain aspects of the past while minimizing or forgetting others. These features of memory create tensions between fidelity to truth and construction of meaning, between accurate representation of what actually happened and creation of narratives that support present, identity and future projects. De Beauvoir explores these tensions throughout her autobiographical writings, reflecting explicitly on the challenges of remembering and narrating her own life. She recognizes that the past she describes in her memoirs is not simply the past as it objectively was, but rather the past as it appears from her present perspective, shaped by knowledge of how things turned out and by current understanding of patterns and meanings that were not visible while living through particular moments. This does not mean that her autobiographical accounts are fictional or that they abandon concern for truth. Rather, it reflects recognition that different kinds of truth about the past coexist in complex relationship. There is factual truth about what actually happened, what was said and done, what events occurred in what sequence. This factual truth can be verified through documents, testimony of others who were present, and other external evidence. But there is also experiential truth about how events were lived and felt, what they meant to those experiencing them, how they shaped consciousness and identity. This experiential truth is less accessible to external verification, but no less real or important for understanding human existence. The relationship between individual memory and collective memory adds another layer of complexity. We remember not only our own personal experiences but also events that occurred before we were born or that we did not directly witness, incorporated into our memory through family stories, historical narratives, cultural traditions, and political mythologies. These collective memories shape our understanding of who we are as members of particular communities, nations, and historical traditions. They provide frameworks for interpreting present circumstances and imagining future possibilities. But collective memories, like individual ones, are selective, interpretive, and motivated. They serve present identity construction projects and political purposes that may require emphasizing certain aspects of the past, while minimizing or forgetting others. Dominant groups construct and propagate historical narratives that justify their position and make existing arrangements seem natural or inevitable. Subordinated groups develop counter-memories that challenge dominant narratives and provide resources for resistance and liberation. Struggles over how the past should be remembered and narrated are simultaneously struggles over present identity and future possibility. De Beauvoir's engagement with these questions appears throughout her work, but receives extended treatment in her memoirs and in texts like A Very Easy Death, her account of her mother's final illness and death. These works demonstrate how personal memory and narrative intersect with larger historical forces and social patterns. Her mother's life and death exemplify general features of women's experience in early 20th century bourgeois France: the narrowness of acceptable roles, the sacrifice of individual aspiration to family duty, the dependence on men for economic security and social identity, the devaluation that comes with aging and loss of reproductive capacity. Yet de Beauvoir's account also insists on her mother's irreducible particularity, her individual consciousness and experience that cannot be entirely subsumed under general patterns. The tension between treating her mother as exemplifying general features of women's oppression and honouring her particular existence as a unique individual reflects larger questions about the relationship between philosophical generalization and attention to concrete particularity. Existentialist philosophy insists on beginning with concrete individual existence before developing general analyses, and this means maintaining respect for individuality even while recognizing patterns and structures that transcend any particular case. The narrative dimension of historical understanding concerns how events are organized into stories that give them meaning and significance. Historical events do not come prepackaged as stories with beginnings, middles, and ends, with protagonists and antagonists, with plot developments and resolutions. These narrative structures are imposed on events through the interpretive activity of those who tell the history, reflecting their perspectives, purposes, and assumptions about what matters and why. De Beauvoir recognizes that multiple narrative frames can be applied to the same events, producing different and sometimes incompatible understandings of what happened and why it matters. The narrative of progress sees history as gradual advancement toward greater freedom, justice, and human flourishing, with setbacks and regressions but overall positive trajectory. The narrative of decline sees history as fall from earlier golden age, with contemporary problems reflecting corruption or loss of values that should be restored. The narrative of eternal return sees history as cyclical repetition of basic patterns, with apparent changes masking deeper continuities. Each narrative frame highlights certain features while obscuring others, makes certain events seem significant while treating others as peripheral, suggests certain lessons and conclusions while making others difficult to perceive. The choice of narrative frame is thus not neutral, but shapes what can be learned from history and what possibilities can be imagined for the future. De Beauvoir's own historical narratives, particularly in the second sex's extensive historical sections, tracing the development of gender relations across different societies and periods, reflect her commitment to narrative frameworks that emphasize both historical change and ongoing structures of oppression, both human agency in creating social arrangements and material constraints that limit what is possible at particular historical moments. dimension of memory and narrative concerns obligations to truth and to those whose experiences we remember and narrate. Do we have duties to remember particular events or individuals? What responsibilities accompany the power to shape historical narratives? How should we balance the needs of present identity construction against fidelity to past experience? De Beauvoir's approach to these questions reflects her characteristic refusal of simple answers, combined with insistence on facing difficult questions honestly. She recognizes duties to remember, particularly to remember suffering and oppression that dominant groups would prefer to forget, to keep alive the memory of those who resisted and struggled for liberation even when their efforts failed in the short term. But she also recognizes that memory can become burden or trap, that excessive attachment to the past can prevent engagement with present possibilities and future projects. The challenge is to maintain relationship with the past that honors what deserves to be remembered while leaving space for transformation and new creation. Her own autobiographical project exemplifies one approach to negotiating these tensions, writing detailed, honest accounts of her experience that acknowledge both achievements and failures, that resist the temptation to make herself appear better than she was, while also refusing false modesty that would minimize her genuine accomplishments. She shows herself struggling with the same existential dilemmas she analyzes philosophically, sometimes succeeding in achieving authentic existence, and sometimes falling into bad faith, always learning and developing rather than achieving some final perfect state. This commitment to honesty in autobiographical writing reflects her understanding that memory and narrative should serve truth, even when truth is uncomfortable or unflattering. But it also reflects recognition that complete transparency is impossible, that some experiences resist articulation, that privacy and discretion have legitimate place, that even the most honest memoir constructs as much as it reveals. The goal is not some impossible ideal of total transparency, but rather something like authentic representation, narratives that capture important truths about experience, even if they cannot capture every truth or fully represent the density and complexity of lived reality. Part 11. Authentic Love and Human Relationships. Among Simone de Beauvoir's most profound and controversial contributions to existentialist thought lies her analysis of love and intimate relationships. While traditional philosophy had largely treated love as either a private emotional matter irrelevant to serious philosophical inquiry or as a secondary application of general ethical principles, de Beauvoir recognized that how human beings relate to each other in intimate relationships reveals fundamental structures of consciousness, freedom, and intersubjectivity. Moreover, she understood that the possibility of authentic love relationships that affirm rather than negate freedom represents one of the central challenges and achievements of human existence. The philosophical problem of love emerges directly from the existentialist analysis of consciousness and freedom. Each human being is a free consciousness, a for itself that exists as project toward possibilities rather than as completed thing. Each of us experiences ourselves from within as subject, as the center of a world organized around our perspective and oriented toward our projects. But we also exist as objects for other consciousnesses who perceive us from their perspectives and incorporate us into their projects. This dual existence as simultaneously subject for ourselves and object for others creates the fundamental tension that characterizes all interpersonal relationships. Traditional romantic ideology, which de Beauvoir subjects to devastating critique, promises to resolve this tension through fusion of two consciousnesses into perfect unity. The romantic lover imagines achieving such complete union with the beloved that all separation between self and other disappears, that two become one in perfect harmony and mutual transparency. This ideal of fusion love appears in countless poems, novels, songs, and films that celebrate romantic love as the highest human achievement and ultimate source of meaning and happiness. But de Beauvoir shows how this ideal of fusion love actually represents a form of bad faith that denies the fundamental structures of human existence. Two consciousnesses cannot literally fuse into one without one or both, losing their character as conscious subjects. The very thing that makes each person lovable, their existence as free consciousness capable of choosing and creating meaning, would have to be eliminated for fusion to occur. What appears as the highest affirmation of love actually represents its negation, the destruction of the freedom and subjectivity that constitute the beloved's humanity. Moreover, the pursuit of fusion love typically masks relations of domination, in which one person seeks to possess the other as object while maintaining their own subjectivity. or in which both seek to escape from the burden of freedom by losing themselves in the other. The man who claims to love a woman so completely that he cannot live without her often actually means that he requires her constant presence and devotion to validate his existence and serve his needs. The woman who sacrifices her own projects and ambitions to devote herself entirely to her beloved often actually seeks escape from the responsibility of freedom through submission to another's will. De Beauvoir's critique of romantic fusion love does not mean rejecting love altogether, but rather distinguishes authentic from inauthentic love, liberating from oppressive love, relationships that affirm from those that negate freedom. Authentic love, she argues, recognizes and affirms the irreducible otherness of the beloved, the fact that the beloved exists as a separate consciousness with their own perspective, their own projects, their own freedom that cannot be fully known or controlled. Rather than seeking to possess or fuse with the beloved, authentic love delights in the beloved's otherness, supports the beloved's projects, and creates space for the beloved to exercise their freedom. This authentic love requires what de Beauvoir calls reciprocity, mutual recognition in which each lover experiences themselves as both subject and object for the other without this dual existence becoming a source of conflict or domination. Each lover recognizes the other as free subject, whose existence enriches their own world rather than threatening it. Each supports the other's projects while pursuing their own. Each experiences their relationship as expansion rather than limitation of possibility, a source of new meanings and values rather than as demand to sacrifice themselves or subjugate the other. But achieving this reciprocity proves extraordinarily difficult in actual human relationships, because it requires overcoming not only individual psychological tendencies toward possession and dependency, but also social structures and cultural patterns that organize relationships according to hierarchies of domination. In societies structured by gender inequality, authentic reciprocity between men and women becomes nearly impossible, because the entire framework of masculine and feminine identities, social roles, and cultural expectations positions men and women as complementary opposites rather than as equals capable of mutual recognition. De Beauvoir's analysis in The Second Sex reveals how traditional arrangements of love and marriage systematically prevent authentic reciprocity by positioning women as subordinate partners whose primary purpose is to serve men's needs and projects. The wife is expected to subordinate her own ambitions to support her husband's career, to sacrifice her own desires to maintain domestic harmony, to find satisfaction in facilitating her husband's freedom rather than exercising her own. This arrangement may be masked by romantic ideology that celebrates women's supposed natural capacity for self-sacrifice and glorifies their role as helpmeets and muses, but it remains fundamentally a relationship of domination rather than reciprocity. The consequences of this asymmetry extend far beyond formal inequalities to shape the psychological and emotional dynamics of intimate relationships. Women learn to experience love as self-sacrifice, to measure their worth by their capacity to please and serve others, to derive identity from relationships rather than autonomous projects. Men learn to experience love as possession and entitlement, to expect women to accommodate their needs without reciprocal accommodation, to maintain emotional distance and independence while requiring women's emotional availability and dependence. These gendered patterns of love create what de Beauvoir identifies as a vicious circle. Women's economic and social dependence on men gives them strong incentives to cultivate the emotional and domestic skills that make them valuable to men. But this specialization in emotional labor and relationship maintenance reinforces their dependence and limits their capacity to develop the independence that would enable authentic reciprocity. Men's economic and social privileges free them from needing to develop emotional sensitivity and relationship skills, but this emotional underdevelopment limits their capacity for genuine intimacy and leaves them dependent on women for emotional life, even while maintaining formal independence. Breaking this vicious circle requires transformation at multiple levels simultaneously. Women must gain economic independence that frees them from dependence on men for survival and security. Social structures must change to support women's participation in public life and men's participation in domestic life. Cultural meanings must transform to value emotional development in men and independence in women. And individuals must undertake the difficult psychological work of overcoming internalized patterns and creating new forms of relationship based on reciprocity rather than domination. de Beauvoir's own relationship with Jean-Paul Sartre provided a laboratory for experimenting with alternative forms of intimate partnership. Their famous pact, established when they were young students at the École Normale Supérieure, attempted to create a relationship of authentic reciprocity that would affirm both partners' freedom. They agreed to maintain a primary relationship characterized by complete honesty and intellectual partnership, while also preserving freedom for contingent relationships with others. They refused conventional marriage with its legal and social conventions that would position them in traditional gender roles. They maintained separate residences and independent careers while sharing intellectual work and engaging in daily conversation about philosophy, literature, and politics. This experiment in authentic love has been subjected to extensive scrutiny and varying interpretations. Some celebrate it as successfully creating a relationship of genuine reciprocity between intellectual equals who supported each other's work, while maintaining individual freedom. Others criticize it as reflecting male privilege, with Sartre's freedom to pursue other relationships taken as given, while de Beauvoir's freedom remained more constrained by her emotional attachment to him and by social conventions that judged women more harshly for sexual freedom. De Beauvoir's own reflections on the relationship in her memoirs and in the interviews collected after Sartre's death reveal complex truths that resist simple celebration or condemnation. The relationship provided genuine intellectual partnership and emotional support that enriched both partners' lives and work, but it also involved pain, jealousy, and asymmetries that de Beauvoir sometimes minimized in public presentations. Her commitment to honesty in later reflections acknowledges both the achievements and limitations of their experiment, neither romanticizing it as perfect realization of authentic love, nor dismissing it as complete failure. The broader philosophical significance of their relationship lies less in whether it achieved perfect reciprocity than in its demonstration that alternative forms of intimate partnership are possible, that conventional arrangements need not be accepted as natural or inevitable, that human beings can experiment with creating relationships that better serve freedom and flourishing. Even if their particular experiment had limitations and produced costs as well as benefits, it expanded the range of imaginable possibilities and provided resources for others seeking to create authentic relationships outside conventional frameworks. De Beauvoir's analysis of love extends beyond romantic and sexual relationships to encompass other forms of intimacy and connection: friendships, familial relationships, political solidarities, intellectual collaborations. Each of these relationship forms raises questions about how to achieve genuine reciprocity, how to recognize and affirm the other's freedom, how to create bonds that enrich rather than constrain the participants. The same principles that guide authentic romantic love apply mutatis mutandis to these other relationships: recognition of otherness, support for projects, creation of shared meanings and values, rejection of possession and domination. Friendship receives particular attention in de Beauvoir's analysis as potentially the purest form of reciprocal relationship because it typically involves less social structuring and fewer conventional expectations than romantic or familial relationships. Friends choose each other based on genuine affinity and shared interests rather than biological connection or sexual attraction. Friendship typically involves less demand for exclusivity and less tendency toward possession than romantic love. Friends can more easily maintain separate lives and independent projects while sharing what draws them together. Yet friendship too can become inauthentic when it serves needs for validation rather than genuine appreciation of the other, when it involves using the other as means to one's own ends, when it creates dependencies that constrain rather than enable freedom. Authentic friendship, like authentic romantic love, requires ongoing attention to maintaining reciprocity, respecting boundaries, supporting the other's flourishing, and adjusting the relationship as both parties change and develop over time. The political dimensions of love concern how intimate relationships either support or undermine larger social structures of domination and liberation. Relationships that reproduce traditional gender hierarchies, that position some partners as subjects and others as objects, that involve emotional or economic exploitation, contribute to maintaining oppressive social systems even when the individuals involved believe themselves to be acting from love. Conversely, relationships that achieve genuine reciprocity, that affirm freedom for all parties, that refuse conventional hierarchies, contribute to creating new possibilities and modeling alternative ways of relating that can inspire others and support movements for collective liberation. This means that the personal is political, that how we conduct our intimate relationships matters not only for our private happiness, but for the larger social world we create and maintain through our actions. The man who treats his partner as equal in their relationship contributes to undermining patriarchy, even if he does not participate in formal political movements. The woman who maintains her independence and pursues her own projects models possibilities for other women, even if she does not explicitly advocate for women's liberation. The couple who successfully creates reciprocal relationship provides evidence that alternatives to domination are possible and offers hope to others struggling to transform their own relationships. But de Beauvoir also warns against instrumentalizing relationships, treating them merely as means to political ends rather than as valuable in themselves. Authentic love has its own intrinsic value as a form of human flourishing and connection that enriches life regardless of its political consequences. While recognizing the political dimensions of intimate relationships, we must not reduce them entirely to politics or evaluate them solely by their contribution to liberation movements. The challenge is to maintain both dimensions in productive tension, appreciating relationships for what they are in themselves while also remaining aware of their social and political significance. Part 12. The Weight of Privilege and the Ethics of Complicity. One of Simone de Beauvoir's most uncomfortable but essential contributions to ethical thought concerns her analysis of how those who benefit from systems of oppression bear responsibility even when they do not directly participate in oppressive acts and may sincerely oppose the systems from which they benefit. This analysis, developed throughout her work but receiving particular attention in her discussions of class privilege, colonialism, and gender hierarchy, challenges comfortable assumptions about moral innocence and forces confrontation with the ways that we are all implicated in structures we did not create and may not consciously support. The philosophical foundation for this analysis lies in de Beauvoir's understanding of situation and social existence. As we have seen, human beings are always situated, always embedded in social structures and historical processes that shape our possibilities and give meaning to our actions. But these structures and processes are not natural givens that exist independently of human action. They are created and maintained through countless individual choices and institutional practices that accumulate over time into apparently objective social realities. Systems of oppression exist because people in each generation make choices that reproduce them, even when most of those people would claim to oppose oppression if asked directly. Those who occupy privileged positions within hierarchical systems benefit from oppression even when they personally commit no oppressive acts, and may genuinely wish that the systems did not exist. The white person in a racist society benefits from racial hierarchy whether or not they personally harbour racist attitudes or discriminate against people of colour. The man in a patriarchal society benefits from gender hierarchy whether or not he personally holds misogynistic views or treats women badly. The wealthy person in a class-stratified society benefits from economic inequality, whether or not they exploited anyone directly to acquire their wealth. These benefits of privilege operate through multiple mechanisms that often remain invisible to those who enjoy them. Privileged groups have greater access to resources, opportunities, education, employment, political power, cultural representation, and simple freedom from harassment and discrimination. They can move through the world with a sense of ease and belonging that is denied to subordinated groups who must constantly navigate hostility, suspicion, exclusion, and degradation. They can assume that institutions will serve their interests, that authorities will protect them, that their perspectives will be recognized as valid and their experiences as normal. Perhaps most insidiously, privileged groups can afford the luxury of not thinking about the systems that privilege them. A man can go through life without ever seriously reflecting on how gender hierarchy shapes his experience because that hierarchy operates in his favour, removing obstacles and creating opportunities without requiring his conscious attention or effort. A white person can ignore race and racism because racial privilege means that their race is treated as default human rather than as particular marked category. A wealthy person can remain unaware of how economic systems work because those systems deliver benefits automatically without requiring understanding. This invisibility of privilege to those who possess it creates what de Beauvoir identifies as a particular form of bad faith, the denial or minimization of one's own complicity in oppressive systems through claims of personal innocence or ignorance. The privileged person who says, "I never discriminated against anyone," or "I worked hard for everything I have," or "I can't help the circumstances of my birth," uses factually true statements to avoid recognizing how they have benefited from and continue to participate in systems that harm others. Their personal non-participation in particular oppressive acts does not eliminate their responsibility for the larger structures that advantage them at others' expense. De Beauvoir's analysis reveals the complexity of this responsibility without reducing it to simple guilt or blame. She distinguishes between different levels and forms of complicity that carry different degrees of responsibility. There is active participation in oppression through discriminatory actions, exclusionary practices, or direct exercise of unjust power. There is passive complicity through acceptance of privileges without working to transform the systems that confer them. There is unconscious complicity through internalization of oppressive assumptions and reproduction of oppressive patterns without awareness that one is doing so. And there is what might be called structural complicity, the simple fact of occupying a privileged position within a hierarchical system, regardless of one's attitudes or actions. Each form of complicity calls for different responses. Active participation in oppression requires cessation of oppressive acts, reparation for harm caused, and transformation of attitudes and behavior. Passive complicity requires recognizing one's privileges, using them to support liberation rather than merely enjoying them, and working to transform systems rather than accepting them as given. Unconscious complicity requires developing awareness of how oppressive patterns operate, examining one's own assumptions and behaviors, and undertaking the difficult work of changing habits and patterns developed over a lifetime. Structural complicity requires acknowledging one's position, understanding how it shapes one's perspective and possibilities, and accepting certain limitations on one's moral authority that come from benefiting from injustice, even if one opposes it. The ethics of privilege and complicity become particularly complex in situations where individuals occupy simultaneously privileged and oppressed positions within different hierarchical systems. A white woman benefits from racial privilege while experiencing gender oppression. A working-class man benefits from gender privilege while experiencing class oppression. A wealthy person of color benefits from class privilege while experiencing racial oppression. These intersecting positions create complicated relationships to systems of domination that resist simple categorization as either oppressor or oppressed. De Beauvoir's analysis suggests that these intersecting positions require careful attention to context and particularity in moral judgment. Someone who experiences oppression in one domain may be more sensitive to recognizing oppression in others, but they may also use their own experience of oppression to excuse their participation in other forms of domination. The woman who has experienced sexism may be better positioned to recognize racism, but she may also use her gender oppression to avoid acknowledging her racial privilege. Moral clarity requires examining each form of privilege and oppression separately, while also recognizing how they interact and reinforce each other. The question of what privileged people owe to those who are oppressed has no simple answer that applies universally across all situations. De Beauvoir rejects both the view that privileged people should simply renounce their privileges through individual acts of sacrifice, and the view that they bear no particular responsibilities beyond general ethical obligations that apply to everyone. Individual renunciation of privilege, while perhaps psychologically satisfying, typically does little to transform the systems that create privilege in the first place. If a wealthy person gives away their money but does nothing to challenge economic structures that create wealth inequality, the privilege simply passes to someone else, without the system itself changing. But neither can privileged people escape responsibility by claiming that they are merely individuals who happen to occupy particular positions within systems they did not create. The systems exist and continue to exist because people in each generation make choices that reproduce them, even seemingly neutral choices like where to live, where to send one's children to school, whom to hire, what causes to support, how to spend one's money all either reinforce existing hierarchies or work to transform them. There is no neutral ground where one can stand outside systems of privilege and oppression. De Beauvoir's own position as a white, educated, financially secure French woman shapes her analysis of these questions and sometimes limits her perspective. She writes powerfully about women's oppression based on her own experience, but has less to say about racial oppression or colonialism, where her position as beneficiary limits her insight. Her treatment of class oppression shows awareness of how economic inequality constrains freedom, but sometimes underestimates how thoroughly working-class experience differs from bourgeois experience. Her analysis of colonialism becomes more sophisticated over time as she engages with anti-colonial movements and recognizes her own complicity in French colonialism. These limitations in her analysis do not invalidate her insights, but rather illustrate the very point she makes about how privilege shapes perspective and limits understanding. Even the most brilliant and ethically committed thinkers cannot fully transcend the limitations of their situations. This recognition should inspire humility about one's own perspective and openness to learning from those differently situated, not paralyzing doubt about whether understanding across difference is possible. The practical implications of de Beauvoir's analysis of privilege and complicity extend to multiple domains of contemporary ethical and political life. In professional contexts, it means recognizing how credentials, networks, cultural capital, and assumptions about competence and authority advantage some groups over others. In educational contexts, it means acknowledging how curriculum, pedagogy, institutional culture, and assessment practices embody particular perspectives and serve particular interests. In political contexts, it means understanding how formal equality under law coexists with profound substantive inequality in actual political power and influence. But the most challenging implications concern what individuals should do with recognition of their own privilege and complicity. De Beauvoir suggests that authentic response requires ongoing attention to multiple dimensions of responsibility, educating oneself about systems of oppression and one's position within them, using whatever privileges one has to support liberation rather than merely enjoying them, working to transform oppressive structures rather than simply opting out of them, accepting criticism and learning from those who experience oppression one does not share, and maintaining humility about the limits of one's understanding and the possibility that one's well-intentioned actions may nonetheless cause harm. This response cannot be accomplished once and for all, but requires sustained effort over time, constant vigilance against complacency, willingness to be uncomfortable and to have one's self-understanding challenged. It requires balancing recognition of one's privilege and complicity with maintenance of capacity for action and hope. The goal is neither paralyzing guilt that prevents action nor defensive denial that preserves comfort, but rather what might be called accountable engagement, action informed by awareness of one's position and its limitations, committed to liberation even when one cannot fully transcend one's own privilege, accepting responsibility while recognizing that individual transformation alone cannot substitute for collective structural change. Part 13. Mortality, Meaning, and the Retrospective View. The distinctive character of human existence for Simone de Beauvoir emerges most clearly in our relationship to death. Unlike other animals who simply die when their biological processes cease, human beings know that they will die, understand death as future possibility that gives urgency and meaning to present choices, struggle to find ways of accepting mortality without being paralyzed by it. This consciousness of death shapes every dimension of human existence, from our most intimate personal choices to our grandest collective projects. Understanding how to live authentically in the face of death represents one of the central challenges of human existence and one of the crucial tests of existentialist philosophy. Traditional philosophical and religious responses to mortality had typically sought to deny or minimize death's significance through belief in personal immortality. Whether through religious doctrines of eternal life or philosophical theories of the immortal soul, these traditions promised that death was not really final, that the essential self would persist beyond bodily death, that earthly existence was merely preparation for eternal existence elsewhere. These beliefs provided comfort and helped people accept their mortality, but de Beauvoir recognized that they also involved bad faith, refusal to honestly confront the reality that we are finite beings whose existence will end absolutely. Existentialist philosophy insists on facing mortality honestly, without evasions or consoling illusions. Death is final, absolute, the end of existence rather than transition to another form of being. When I die, I cease to exist as conscious subject experiencing and creating meaning. The world will continue without me. Others will live and act and create, but I will not be present to witness or participate. This finality of death cannot be avoided or overcome, only accepted as fundamental condition of human existence that must be integrated into how we understand ourselves and conduct our lives. But accepting the finality of death does not require morbid preoccupation with mortality or adopting an attitude of despair about the pointlessness of existence that will inevitably end. De Beauvoir shows how consciousness of death, properly understood, actually intensifies rather than negates the meaning and value of life. Precisely because our existence is finite, because we have limited time and must eventually die, each choice matters, each moment possesses weight and significance, each relationship and project deserves full engagement rather than casual attention. If we had infinite time, nothing would be urgent and choices could always be postponed. But because time is limited and death is certain, we must choose how to use the time we have, and these choices constitute who we are and what our lives mean. This relationship between mortality and meaning receives extended treatment in All Men Are Mortal, de Beauvoir's novel about an immortal protagonist who cannot die. Through this thought experiment, she explores how immortality would actually undermine rather than enhance the possibility of meaningful existence. The immortal man experiences everything as provisional and temporary because he knows he will outlive everyone and everything. Relationships lose their depth because he knows they will end while he persists. Projects lose their urgency because he has infinite time to accomplish them or to begin new ones. Historical changes lose their significance because he has witnessed countless similar changes before and will witness countless more in the future. The novel suggests that meaning emerges not despite but through our finitude, not in opposition to mortality but in relationship with it. We can fully invest ourselves in relationships precisely because they are limited, because the other person will die, and we will die, and the time we have together is precious exactly because it is limited. We can commit ourselves to projects with full engagement precisely because we have finite time and energy, because choosing one project means forgoing others, because what we create during our limited lifetimes will be our legacy. We can appreciate moments of beauty, connection, and joy precisely because they are fleeting, because they will pass and cannot be held forever. But de Beauvoir also recognizes tragic dimensions of mortality that cannot be entirely transformed into sources of meaning. Death comes for us before we have completed what we hope to accomplish, before we have fully developed our capacities, before we have said everything we meant to say to those we love. It cuts short relationships that might have deepened further, terminates projects that might have borne more fruit, ends experiences that we wished would continue. And death often comes painfully, through disease or injury that degrades the body and diminishes consciousness before finally ending it. These tragic aspects of mortality cannot be rationalized away or made meaningful through philosophical reflection. Her treatment of her mother's death in A Very Easy Death captures both existential and tragic dimensions of mortality with unflinching honesty. The memoir describes in painful detail the physical deterioration and suffering that preceded her mother's death, refusing to romanticize or sanitize the actual experience of dying. But it also explores the complex meanings that her mother's death held for de Beauvoir herself. The recognition of her own mortality reflected in her mother's death, the complicated mixture of grief and relief that came with the end of a relationship that had always been difficult, the retrospective re-evaluation of her mother's life from the perspective of its completion. This retrospective view, the understanding of a life that becomes possible only after death, raises important questions about meaning and judgment. While someone is alive, their existence remains open to new possibilities, capable of taking new directions, potentially able to transform or transcend whatever they have been until now. But death closes these possibilities and fixes the person's existence as what it was, no longer subject to revision or development. From this retrospective perspective, we can see patterns and meanings that were not visible while the life was being lived, can evaluate whether the person used their freedom well or poorly, can judge whether they achieved anything worth achieving or wasted their opportunities. But de Beauvoir recognizes dangers in this retrospective judgment. It can seem to suggest that a life's meaning lies entirely in what it has produced or accomplished, reducing persons to their achievements, and devaluing lives that do not result in lasting works or historical impact. It can also encourage the living to organize their lives entirely around concern for how they will be judged after death, sacrificing present satisfaction to future reputation. and it can obscure the ways that lives have meaning for those living them through experiences and relationships that leave no lasting traces, that matter intensely in the moment even if they are forgotten after death. The relationship between individual mortality and collective continuity adds another dimension to these questions. Each individual dies, but humanity continues, carrying forward projects and meanings that individuals initiated but could not complete. This collective continuity provides a kind of immortality through works and influences that persist beyond any individual life. The artist whose works continue to be appreciated, the thinker whose ideas continue to influence others, the activist whose struggles advance movements that continue after their death, all achieve a form of persistence beyond their biological death. But de Beauvoir warns against making this collective continuity into a consolation for individual mortality, or treating it as genuine immortality. The works and influences that persist are not the same as the living person who created them. They are transformed by new contexts and interpretations that the original creator cannot control or even anticipate. Moreover, most people leave no lasting works or influences that persist long beyond their deaths. Their lives matter to those who knew and loved them, but after a few generations, even memory of them fades. This is not tragic failure, but simply the reality of finite existence that creates meaning through particular relationships and experiences rather than through permanent achievement. De Beauvoir's treatment of suicide and the question of whether and when someone might be justified in choosing death reveals her characteristic refusal of absolutist positions. She rejects both the view that suicide is always wrong, an absolute violation of the sanctity of life, and the view that existence can become so burdensome that death is always a rational choice when suffering becomes unbearable. Instead, she approaches each situation with attention to its particular circumstances and the meanings that death would have for the person and for others whose lives are intertwined with theirs. Suicide might be justified when continued existence involves unbearable suffering with no possibility of relief, when all meaningful projects have become impossible, when death would end pain without causing disproportionate harm to others. But suicide is not justified when it represents flight from freedom and responsibility, when it expresses despair that refuses to recognize remaining possibilities, when it inflicts devastating harm on others who depend on or love the person. The question cannot be answered abstractly, but requires careful attention to the actual situation, an honest assessment of what continued life or chosen death would mean. Her own aging and eventual death at 78 exemplified many of the themes she had explored philosophically. She continued working until near the end, publishing her final volume of autobiography and a collection of essays just a few years before her death. She maintained relationships with friends and colleagues even as many contemporaries died and her own health declined. She faced the reality of her approaching death with the same honest, clear-sightedness she had brought to analysing mortality throughout her philosophical career, and her death occasioned widespread recognition of her contributions to philosophy, literature, and political thought, ensuring that her works and influence would persist beyond her biological existence. The enduring significance of de Beauvoir's analysis of mortality lies not in providing consoling answers to existential anxieties about death, but in showing how honest confrontation with mortality can deepen rather than diminish engagement with life. By refusing evasions and facing death's finality without illusions, we paradoxically discover resources for living more fully in whatever time we have. By recognizing that our existence is finite and will absolutely end, we discover urgency and significance in choices that might otherwise seem arbitrary or meaningless. By accepting that we will die having accomplished only some of what we hope to achieve, we learn to appreciate what we do accomplish rather than being paralyzed by what we cannot. Part 14. Philosophy as Way of Life. For Simone de Beauvoir, philosophy was never merely an academic discipline or theoretical enterprise confined to specialized texts and professional discussions. It was a way of life, a comprehensive approach to existence that integrated intellectual analysis with practical commitment, abstract thought with concrete engagement, systematic reflection with spontaneous response to situations. Understanding her complete philosophical vision requires recognizing how she embodied her philosophy in the actual conduct of her life, how she used philosophical reflection to illuminate problems encountered in living, and how she understood the relationship between philosophical theory and lived practice. This conception of philosophy as way of life had deep roots in ancient philosophical traditions, particularly Stoicism and Epicureanism, which had understood philosophy primarily as therapeutic practice aimed at achieving eudaimonia, or flourishing rather than as theoretical inquiry aimed at achieving knowledge for its own sake. The ancient philosophers had developed comprehensive teachings about how to live, had created communities of practice organized around shared values and mutual support, had understood philosophical training as formation of character rather than merely accumulation of information. But this ancient conception had been largely lost in modern Western philosophy, which increasingly defined itself as specialized academic discipline concerned primarily with abstract theoretical questions about knowledge, reality, language, and logic. Professional philosophers were expected to develop technical expertise in specialized subfields, to publish research in academic journals addressing questions of interest, primarily to other specialists, to maintain strict boundaries between their philosophical work and their personal lives. Philosophy became something one did in the office or classroom, rather than a comprehensive approach to existence that permeated all dimensions of life. De Beauvoir's career exemplifies resistance to this narrowing of philosophy's scope and ambition. She refused to separate her philosophical work from her literary creation, her political engagement, her personal relationships, or her everyday choices about how to live. She understood all these activities as aspects of a unified philosophical project aimed at understanding and transforming human existence. Her philosophical essays explored theoretical questions about freedom, ethics, and oppression. Her novels and memoirs provided concrete exploration of how these questions arise in actual lived situations. Her political activism expressed commitment to principles articulated philosophically. Her personal life served as laboratory for testing philosophical insights about authentic existence and reciprocal relationships. This integration of theory and practice appears most clearly in how de Beauvoir approached the central, existentialist concept of authenticity. Authenticity was not for her merely a theoretical category to be analysed conceptually, but a practical challenge to be confronted in daily choices and relationships. Being authentic meant recognising and accepting one's freedom, taking responsibility for one's choices, avoiding self-deception about one's motives and situation, resisting pressures toward conformity, maintaining commitment to projects one genuinely values. These requirements could not be satisfied through intellectual understanding alone, but demanded ongoing attention and effort in navigating actual situations. Her relationship with Sartre exemplified this commitment to living authentically according to principles they had articulated philosophically. Their refusal of conventional marriage, their experiment with contingent relationships alongside their primary partnership, their commitment to honesty about their feelings and experiences, their support for each other's work while maintaining individual independence, all represented attempts to create a relationship that affirmed freedom rather than constraining it. Whether they fully succeeded remains debatable, but the attempt itself demonstrated how philosophical principles could guide concrete choices about how to organize intimate life. Similarly, her political engagements reflected commitment to principles about freedom, oppression, and responsibility that she had developed philosophically. When she signed the manifesto of the 343 acknowledging illegal abortion, she risked prosecution to challenge laws that violated women's freedom. When she opposed French colonial policy in Algeria, she used her public platform to condemn state violence, even at cost of criticism and threats. When she supported various liberation movements, she committed time and energy that could have been devoted to her own writing and intellectual work. These political actions were not applications of pre-existing philosophical theory to practical problems, but constitutive elements of her philosophical project itself. The pedagogical dimension of philosophy as way of life concerned how philosophical understanding could be communicated and shared. De Beauvoir rejected the assumption that philosophical teaching primarily involves transmitting information about what various philosophers have said or training students in technical skills of argument analysis. Instead, she understood philosophical education as formation of character and capacity for authentic existence. The teacher's role was not merely to inform, but to provoke and inspire, to challenge students to examine their own assumptions and values, to create conditions in which students could discover their own freedom and learn to exercise it responsibly. Her teaching career, though brief compared to her writing career, exemplified this pedagogical vision. She approached teaching as dialogue and exploration, rather than as one-way transmission of knowledge from expert to novice. She used literature alongside philosophical texts to help students grasp existential situations and ethical dilemmas in their full concrete complexity. She encouraged students to connect philosophical questions with their own experience and to understand philosophy as relevant to their own lives rather than as merely historical or theoretical enterprise. But de Beauvoir also recognized limits to what could be taught or learned through formal philosophical education. Some dimensions of authentic existence, some insights into human freedom and responsibility, some capacities for ethical judgment could be developed only through actual experience of living, of making choices in situations where outcomes matter, of taking responsibility for consequences, of confronting one's own tendencies towards self-deception and bad faith. Philosophical education could prepare people for these challenges but could not substitute for actually facing them. The therapeutic dimension of philosophy as way of life concerned how philosophical reflection could address psychological suffering and existential anxiety. De Beauvoir understood that much human suffering stems not from material deprivation or physical pain alone, but from confusion about meaning and value, from inability to accept contingency and mortality, from conflicts between competing desires and commitments, from guilt and regret about past choices, from anxiety about future possibilities. Philosophical reflection could not eliminate these sources of suffering, but could help people understand them more clearly and develop resources for coping with them. This therapeutic function of philosophy throughout her work, but receives particular emphasis in her discussions of aging and death. By helping people understand mortality as a fundamental condition of human existence rather than as aberration or punishment, by showing how acceptance of finitude can intensify rather than diminish life's meaning, by articulating frameworks for evaluating lives retrospectively without falling into regret or despair, she provided resources for facing death with dignity and grace. Her own example of continuing to work, create and engage with life even as she aged and faced her own mortality offered inspiration to others confronting similar challenges. The communal dimension of philosophy as way of life concerned how philosophical practice could create relationships and communities organized around shared values and commitments. De Beauvoir's participation in various intellectual and political circles throughout her life exemplified this communal aspect. Her relationships with Sartre, with the existentialist circle that gathered around them, with feminist activists in the later phase of her career, with writers and intellectuals from around the world, all involved not merely exchange of ideas, but creation of shared forms of life oriented toward liberation and authentic existence. These philosophical communities provided multiple benefits for participants. They offered intellectual stimulation and challenge that sharpened thinking and expanded perspectives. They provided emotional support and solidarity that made it easier to resist conformist pressures and maintain commitment to difficult principles. They created spaces where alternative values and practices could be developed and tested, and they served as bases for political action and social change, translating philosophical insights into collective projects aimed at transforming oppressive structures. But de Beauvoir also recognized dangers in philosophical communities, particularly tendencies toward dogmatism, groupthink, personality cults, and internal power struggles that could reproduce oppressive patterns these communities ostensibly opposed. She maintained a degree of independence even from communities to which she belonged, preserving capacity for critical judgment and willingness to challenge consensus when it seemed to violate principles or serve narrow interests. This balance between engagement and independence, between solidarity and critical distance, exemplifies her understanding of how philosophical practice requires both community and individual autonomy. The aesthetic dimension of philosophy as way of life concerned how philosophical practice involves cultivation of perceptiveness, sensitivity and judgment that have aesthetic as well as ethical character. De Beauvoir understood that responding well to situations requires not only abstract principles, but also capacity to perceive relevant features of particular circumstances, to appreciate nuances and complexities that resist capture in general rules, to create responses that possess elegance and appropriateness, rather than merely following correct procedures. This aesthetic dimension appears clearly in her literary work, where philosophical insights are expressed through carefully crafted prose that achieves its effects through style as much as content, through imagery and rhythm as much as argument, through narrative structure as much as explicit statement. But it also appears in her understanding of how to live well, how to create a life that possesses beauty and coherence as well as moral integrity, how to respond to situations with grace and wisdom rather than merely correct behaviour. The ultimate goal of philosophy as way of life, in de Beauvoir's vision, is not to achieve perfection or to discover final truths that would resolve all questions. Rather, it is to develop capacities and orientations that enable ongoing navigation of existence's fundamental challenges, accepting freedom and responsibility, resisting self-deception, maintaining authentic relationships, engaging with political struggles, facing mortality with courage, creating meaning in an existence that provides no inherent meaning. Philosophy cannot eliminate these challenges or provide formulas that would make them easy, but it can provide resources for addressing them with honesty, courage, wisdom, and grace. Part 15. The Legacy and Continuing Relevance. As we reach the end of our journey through Simone de Beauvoir's complete philosophical vision, we must consider the question of her legacy and continuing relevance. Nearly 4 decades after her death, and more than 7 decades after the publication of her major works, de Beauvoir's thought continues to inspire, provoke, and challenge readers around the world. Understanding why her philosophy remains vital requires examining both the enduring insights she articulated and the ways her work has been taken up and extended by subsequent generations of thinkers and activists. The most obvious dimension of de Beauvoir's legacy concerns her contributions to feminist thought and women's liberation movements. The second sex remains foundational text in feminist theory, its central insight that one is not born, but becomes a woman continuing to shape how gender is understood and analysed. Her systematic critique of the mechanisms through which women are constructed as other, her analysis of how feminine conditioning operates to limit women's freedom, her vision of women's liberation as requiring both external structural change and internal transformation of consciousness, all provided resources for feminist movements that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s and continue to shape contemporary feminism. But de Beauvoir's influence on feminist thought extends beyond the second sex to her entire philosophical project. Her integration of existentialist philosophy with analysis of oppression provided model for understanding how abstract philosophical concepts like freedom, situation, and bad faith could illuminate concrete patterns of domination and subordination. Her insistence that liberation requires addressing both material conditions and cultural meanings anticipated later developments in feminist theory that moved beyond simple economic or legal approaches to recognize the complexity of gender oppression. Her attention to how different women experience oppression differently depending on their race, class, and other circumstances prefigured contemporary intersectional approaches to feminist analysis. Subsequent feminist theorists have both built on and critiqued de Beauvoir's work in productive ways. Some have questioned whether her emphasis on transcendence over immanence, on achievement and independence over relationship and care, reflects masculine bias that devalues traditionally feminine activities and capacities. Others have challenged her assumption that women's liberation requires adopting modes of existence traditionally associated with masculinity, rather than transforming how both masculinity and femininity are understood. Still, others have argued that her analysis remains too focused on gender, at the expense of adequately addressing how race, class, sexuality, and other forms of identity and oppression intersect with gender. These critiques have generated valuable developments in feminist theory that extend and refine de Beauvoir's insights while correcting some limitations in her original formulations. Contemporary feminist philosophers have developed more nuanced accounts of how to value both transcendence and immanence, how to honour care and relationship without falling into essentialist celebrations of supposedly natural feminine qualities, how to analyse intersecting oppressions without reducing any to others. But these developments build on foundations that de Beauvoir established, using conceptual tools she developed while pushing beyond limitations in her particular applications of them. Beyond feminist theory specifically, de Beauvoir's existentialist philosophy continues to offer resources for addressing perennial human questions about freedom, responsibility, authenticity, and meaning. In an era characterized by rapid technological change, increasing social complexity, and the erosion of traditional sources of meaning and identity, her insights about how human beings create meaning in an existence that provides no inherent meaning remain urgently relevant. Her analysis of bad faith and self-deception speaks to contemporary phenomena like social media performance and consumer culture that create new forms of inauthenticity. Her understanding of situation and situated freedom provides frameworks for thinking about how emerging technologies and social structures simultaneously enable and constrain human possibility. The political dimensions of de Beauvoir's legacy concern how her work has influenced movements for social justice and human liberation beyond specifically feminist struggles. Her analysis of how oppression operates through both external constraint and internal colonization of consciousness has informed anti-racist, anti-colonial, LGBTQ+, and other liberation movements. Her insistence that liberation requires both individual transformation and collective action has shaped how activists understand the relationship between personal change and political organizing. Her vision of reciprocal recognition and authentic solidarity has provided ideals toward which liberation movements aspire even when they struggle to realize them fully. But de Beauvoir's political legacy also includes failures and limitations that must be acknowledged honestly. Her relative inattention to racial oppression and her sometimes problematic engagement with colonialism reflect limitations of her own situation and perspective that subsequent thinkers have rightly criticized. Her occasional tendencies toward elitism, her assumptions about what constitutes authentic existence that reflect her particular class and cultural location, her sometimes insufficient attention to material constraints that limit possibility for those lacking her advantages, all reveal ways that even brilliant and committed philosophers remain products of their circumstances. These limitations do not invalidate de Beauvoir's contributions, but rather illustrate principles she herself articulated about situated knowledge and the inevitability of blind spots in any particular perspective. They remind us that no single thinker or work can provide complete understanding of human existence in all its complexity, and that philosophical progress requires ongoing dialogue between different perspectives and experiences. They demonstrate the importance of approaching even canonical texts with critical awareness rather than uncritical reverence. The methodological dimensions of de Beauvoir's legacy concern her integration of multiple modes of inquiry and expression, her demonstration that philosophical insight can be pursued through literary form as well as systematic treatises, through memoir and autobiography as well as abstract argument, through political engagement as well as theoretical reflection, has influenced how subsequent philosophers understand their discipline and practice. Contemporary philosophy has seen increased interest in narrative approaches, in attention to concrete particularity alongside abstract generalization, in connections between philosophical work and political commitment that de Beauvoir's example helped make possible. Similarly, her integration of phenomenological description with historical and sociological analysis, of existentialist philosophy with feminist critique, of attention to individual experience with recognition of structural constraint, has provided model for interdisciplinary work that refuses to be confined within narrow disciplinary boundaries. Contemporary philosophers working at intersections of philosophy with gender studies, critical race theory, disability studies, and other fields follow paths that de Beauvoir helped open through her own interdisciplinary practice. The educational dimensions of de Beauvoir's legacy concern how her work continues to be taught and engaged with in academic settings and beyond. Her texts remain widely read in philosophy, literature, and gender studies courses, introducing new generations to existentialist thought and feminist analysis. But perhaps more importantly, her example of philosophy as way of life continues to inspire students and readers to understand philosophy as relevant to their own lives, rather than as merely historical or theoretical enterprise. She demonstrates that rigorous intellectual work and committed engagement with practical problems can be integrated rather than separated, that philosophical reflection can illuminate rather than escape from concrete challenges of living. The existential dimensions of de Beauvoir's continuing relevance concern how her insights address perennial features of human existence that transcend particular historical circumstances. As long as human beings must confront freedom and responsibility, must create meaning in an existence that provides no inherent meaning, must face mortality and accept finitude, must navigate tensions between individual autonomy and social belonging, must struggle against self-deception and strive for authenticity, de Beauvoir's philosophy will remain relevant. These are not problems that can be solved once and for all, but permanent features of the human condition that each generation must confront anew. Her analysis of aging and death speaks with particular power to contemporary societies struggling with demographic transitions and questions about how to care for growing elderly populations. Her insights about authentic love and reciprocal relationships address timeless questions about how to create intimacy that affirms rather than negates freedom. Her understanding of how oppression operates through both external constraint and internal colonization provides frameworks for analyzing new forms of domination as they emerge. Her vision of liberation as ongoing project rather than final achievement recognizes that human freedom must be continually created and defended rather than achieved once and preserved automatically. The ultimate significance of Simone de Beauvoir's philosophical achievement lies not in any single insight or argument, but in the comprehensive vision she articulated of what it means to be human in the modern world. She showed how human beings are simultaneously free and situated, individual and social, finite and capable of transcendence. She demonstrated how authentic existence requires accepting responsibility for creating meaning and value in an existence that provides no inherent meaning or value. She revealed how liberation from oppression requires transforming both external structures and internal consciousness. She articulated vision of human flourishing that honors both individual autonomy and reciprocal relationships, both transcendent projects and immanent care, both intellectual rigor and emotional depth. This comprehensive vision remains as relevant today as when de Beauvoir first articulated it, because it addresses fundamental features of human existence that transcend particular historical circumstances while remaining firmly grounded in concrete realities of embodied, situated historical existence. Her philosophy provides neither final answers nor simple formulas, but rather frameworks for thinking and resources for living that enable ongoing navigation of existence's permanent challenges. It calls us to honesty about our freedom and responsibility, to courage in facing mortality and uncertainty, to wisdom in navigating ambiguity and complexity, to commitment in pursuing liberation despite obstacles and setbacks. As we conclude this exploration of de Beauvoir's complete philosophy, we can appreciate both the extraordinary scope of her achievement and the ways her work remains unfinished, a beginning rather than an end. She opened paths that subsequent thinkers have followed and extended. She asked questions that continue to require answers. She articulated principles that continue to demand implementation. She created works that continue to inspire and challenge readers to examine their own lives, question their own assumptions, and commit themselves to projects of personal transformation and collective liberation. The task of our time is not merely to study de Beauvoir's philosophy as historical artifact, but to engage with it as living tradition that continues to evolve and develop. We honour her legacy not through uncritical reverence, but through critical engagement that preserves what remains valuable while correcting limitations and extending insights to address new circumstances. We fulfill her vision not by treating her works as final authority, but by using them as resources for developing our own capacities for authentic existence and committed action. In this spirit, Simone de Beauvoir's philosophy continues to speak across the decades, offering guidance and inspiration to all who struggle to live freely and authentically in a world that provides no guarantees, who seek to create meaning in an existence that offers no inherent meaning, who commit themselves to liberation even when obstacles seem insurmountable, who refuse the comforts of self-deception in favor of honest confrontation with existence in all its ambiguity and possibility. Her voice joins the great chorus of human wisdom that sustains us in our efforts to become fully human, to exercise our freedom responsibly, to create lives and worlds worthy of our dignity as conscious beings capable of transcending whatever we have been and creating something new.